Sutton Hoo, the greatest ship burial mystery in Europe. It begins not with a shout, but with a whisper in the sandy soil of Suffolk, a place where the earth itself seems to hold onto secrets with a jealous, quiet grip. It is 1939, and while the rest of the world is anxiously watching the storm clouds of war gather over the continent, a woman named Edith Pretty is staring at a cluster of strange, grassy mounds on her estate, convinced that something or someone is waiting beneath the turf. When the archaeologists finally sliced into the largest mound, they didn't find a skeleton or a preserved body, at least not in the traditional sense. What they found was a ghost. It was an impression in the sand, a shadow left behind where oak timbers had once rotted away, leaving only the rusted iron rivets to map out the skeleton of a mighty 90-foot ship. It was a vessel that had been dragged uphill from the River Deben, filled with treasures fit for a king, gold buckles, garnet inlaid shoulder clasps, and that iconic stoic helmet, and then buried deep within the earth to sail through the dark tides of the afterlife. It was a discovery that shattered our understanding of the so-called Dark Ages, proving that this corner of England, this bulging headland we call East Anglia, was once the seat of a power so sophisticated and connected that it traded with Byzantium and Scandinavia. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Invite viewers to post their location and local time before we can fully understand the people who buried that ship, the Woofingas, the wolf people who gave East Anglia its name. We have to rewind the clock further, stripping away the layers of Saxon soil to reveal the Iron Age bedrock beneath, long before the Germanic longships slid onto the shingle beaches. This land of marshes, broad skies, and slow-moving rivers belonged to a tribe known as the Iceni. They were a people of the horse and the sword, living in a landscape that feels distinctly different from the rest of Britain. It is a place where the boundary between land and water is often a matter of opinion, a flat, expansive world where the wind comes rushing in directly from the Urals with nothing to stop it. The Iceni were wealthy, proud, and, for a time, they managed to live in a fragile peace with the new masters of the world, the Romans. It is the middle of the 1st century AD, and the Roman Empire is digesting its conquest of southern Britain, a process that usually involved a lot of road building, tax collecting, and the occasional massacre to keep everyone in line. The Iceni, centered in what is now Norfolk, were technically a client kingdom, ruled by a king named Prasutagus. He was a man trying to walk a very thin tightrope, balancing the fiercely independent nature of his people with the crushing, methodical weight of Rome. He likely wore Roman clothes on occasion, drank Roman wine, and hoped that if he played by the rules, his people would be left alone to farm their rich lands and breed their famous ponies. But Rome, as history repeatedly demonstrates, is rarely a gracious houseguest. Eventually, they want the keys to the whole house, and probably the furniture too. When Prasutagus died around 60 AD, he left a will that was intended to be a masterstroke of diplomacy. He bequeathed half of his kingdom to the Roman Emperor Nero and the other half to his 2 daughters. The logic was sound, at least on paper. Give the bully half your lunch money so he doesn't beat you up for the rest. But the Roman administrators on the ground led by the greedy procurator Catus Decianus, decided that a will written by a barbarian king wasn't worth the papyrus it was scrawled on. They didn't want half, they wanted it all. The transition of power was handled with a brutality that still shocks us 2,000 years later, a calculated display of cruelty designed to break the spirit of the Iceni elite. The Roman soldiers didn't just annex the territory, they pillaged the royal household like common bandits. When Prasutagus' widow, a woman of imposing stature and terrifying red hair named Boudicca, dared to object, she was publicly flogged. To add an even darker stain to the imperial record, her two young daughters were assaulted by Roman soldiers. It was a mistake of catastrophic proportions. The Romans, in their arrogance, thought they were disciplining a unruly widow. In reality, they had just lit a fuse that would nearly blow their entire province into the sea. Boudicca was not just a queen. She was a symbol, a lightning rod for every grievance the British tribes held against the occupiers. She didn't retreat into mourning. She went to war. The uprising that followed was less of a military campaign and more of a tidal wave of vengeance. Boudicca rallied not just the Iceni, but their neighbors to the south, the Trinovantes, who had their own axe to grind regarding the Roman veterans seizing their land in Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester. The image of Boudicca standing in her war chariot, her tawny hair flowing down to her waist, exhorting her troops to victory or death, is one of the most enduring vignettes in British history. And for a brief, bloody season, it seemed like she might actually drive the eagles back to Italy. The tribes descended on Camulodunum, the symbol of Roman rule, and burned it to the ground. The Temple of Claudius, where the elderly veterans and their families huddled for safety, was besieged and destroyed. The archaeology of Colchester still bears the scars of that fire, a layer of red and black destruction debris known as the Boudiccan layer, preserved under the modern streets like a geological trauma. The Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was busy campaigning in Wales, attacking the Druids on the island of Anglesey, which left the southeast of Britain wide open. Boudicca's horde, now numbering in the tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands, turned their eyes toward the commercial hub of Londinium. It wasn't the capital then, but it was a bustling port full of traders, merchants, and bureaucracy. Suetonius raced back, looked at the indefensible sprawl of the city, and made the cold, pragmatic calculation to abandon it. He marched his legions out, leaving the citizens of London to their fate. The Iceni swept in, and the sky turned black with smoke. The heat of the fire was so intense that it melted the red Samian pottery in the shops and fused it into warped, glass-like lumps that you can still see in museums today. Next, they fell upon Verulamium, near modern St. Albans. 3 cities, tens of thousands of Roman and pro-Roman British dead. The rebellion was a firestorm, fueled by decades of resentment, and for a moment, the Roman hold on Britain hung by a thread. But the Romans were nothing if not disciplined. Suetonius picked his ground carefully for the final confrontation, a place somewhere along the chaotic path of Watling Street, likely in the Midlands, though the exact location remains one of history's tantalizing question marks. He chose a narrow defile, with a forest at his back and an open plain in front, negating the sheer numerical advantage of the Britons. The Iceni and their allies arrived in high spirits, so confident of victory that they brought their families, wives, children, grandparents, in wagons to watch the spectacle, parking them in a crescent formation at the rear of the battlefield. It was a festival atmosphere, a celebration of the inevitable end of Rome. The battle that ensued was a grim lesson in the difference between a warrior culture and a professional military machine. The Britons charged, a chaotic, screaming wall of humanity, crashing against the disciplined, shielded lines of the Roman legions. The Romans held, thrusting with their short swords, conserving energy, moving like a single armored organism. When the British momentum faltered, the Romans advanced in a wedge formation, cutting through the lightly armored tribesmen like a plow through soft earth. Panic set in. The Britons tried to flee, but their retreat was blocked by their own ring of wagons and the families who had come to watch the triumph. The slaughter was absolute. It is said that 80,000 Britons died that day, effectively ending the resistance of the Iceni forever. Boudicca, unwilling to be paraded in chains through the streets of Rome, took poison, or perhaps succumbed to sickness, depending on which ancient historian you believe. With her death, a silence fell over East Anglia. The Romans returned, not just with swords, but with a vengeance, devastating the Iceni lands to ensure that such a rebellion could never happen again. The farms were burned, the population decimated, and the region was placed under heavy military surveillance. For generations, the fens and the fields of Norfolk and Suffolk lay quiet, a subdued province producing grain and wool for the empire, crisscrossed by straight Roman roads that ignored the ancient winding tracks of the ancestors. Yet, empires, like tides, eventually recede. As the centuries ground on, the grip of Rome weakened. The legions were recalled to fight civil wars or defend the crumbling frontiers closer to home. The villas, once vibrant with mosaic floors and heated baths, began to decay, their roofs falling in, their gardens slowly reclaimed by the brambles and the hawthorn. The great signal forts along the coast, the Saxon shore forts built to repel raiders, stood empty, staring out at the grey North Sea with blind stone eyes. The breakdown of central authority left a vacuum in East Anglia, a quiet, depopulated land of marshes and slow rivers, waiting for the next wave of history to arrive. And arrive it did, not with the marching boots of legions, but with the creak of wooden oars and the splash of keels on the mudflats. The Angles were coming, drifting out of the mist from across the sea, bringing with them new gods, a new language, and the seeds of a kingdom that would eventually bury a ship full of treasure in the sandy soil of Sutton Hoo. The end of the world didn't come with a bang, or even a sudden scream, but rather with the squeak of a cartwheel and the dusty tramp of boots fading away down a long, straight road. By the early 5th century, the Roman Empire was like an old man trying to hold on to too many heavy bags. Eventually, something had to be dropped, and Britannia was simply the furthest, heaviest, and least profitable bag of the lot. The legions that had garrisoned the forts along the Saxon shore, those massive stone hulks at places like Brancaster and Burke Castle, staring out at the grey horizon, were gradually siphoned off to fight in the desperate civil wars consuming the continent. The coin shipments stopped arriving, which meant the soldiers who remained weren't really soldiers anymore. They were just armed farmers guarding crumbling walls for an emperor who had likely forgotten they existed. In 410 AD, the Emperor Honorius sent his famous letter to the cities of Britain, telling them effectively to look to their own defenses. a polite, bureaucratic way of saying, "Good luck, you're on your own." For the people of East Anglia, the Romano-British citizens who had grown up with underfloor heating, imported wine, and the comforting certainty of Roman law, this was a slow-motion catastrophe. Imagine the lights going out, one by one, across the province. The bathhouses ran cold because there was no one to chop the wood or maintain the furnaces. The mosaics were covered by drifting dirt, and the grand villas that dotted the countryside began to feel less like manor houses and more like indefensible targets. The economy collapsed, not because of a stock market crash, but because the complex web of trade that brought pottery from Gaul and olive oil from Spain simply disintegrated. The region began to hold its breath, sensing a shift in the wind, a change in the pressure of the air itself. And nature, as it always does, began to reclaim its territory. The drainage canals that the Roman engineers had dug to tame the fens silted up, choked by reeds and neglect. The water crept back in, turning the ordered fields of the west into a labyrinth of marshes, mares, and foggy islands. It was into this returning wilderness, this wet and shifting landscape, that the new neighbors arrived. They didn't come as a single conquering army, with banners waving and trumpets blaring. Despite what later Victorian historians might have liked to imagine, they came in drips and drabs, a slow, rising tide of open boats slipping through the mist, navigating the intricate waterways that led deep into the heart of the country. These were the Angles. They came from the hook-shaped peninsula of Ongiln in what is now northern Germany and southern Denmark, a land of heath and sandy soil, not unlike the one they were sailing toward. They were pushed by rising sea levels at home, by overpopulation, and perhaps just by the eternal human itch to find a patch of earth where the grass grew a little greener. To them, the abandoned or lightly defended coast of eastern Britain must have looked like a paradise of opportunity. The Roman defenses, those great forts of the Saxon shore, were no longer barriers. In many cases, they became gateways, or even squatting grounds for the newcomers who looked at the monumental stone walls with a mixture of suspicion and pragmatic use. The migration was a family affair. The archaeology tells us this story not through written chronicles, for the Angles brought no books, only runes scratched on wood or bone, but through the silent testimony of their cemeteries. At places like Spong Hill in Norfolk, we find the largest early Anglo-Saxon cremation cemetery in Britain, containing thousands of urns. This wasn't the burial ground of a war band. It was a community. There were men, yes, buried with spears and shields, but there were also women buried with brooches and loom weights, and children buried with tiny pots. They brought their cattle, their distinct style of pottery, their language, and their gods. Woden, the one-eyed wanderer, and Thunor, the hammer wielder, planting them in the rich East Anglian loam. The interaction between the native British population and these Germanic settlers is one of the great shadowy puzzles of history. For a long time, the narrative was one of total displacement, the idea that the Britons were wiped out or driven west into the mountains of Wales. But the landscape of East Anglia suggests something more complex and perhaps more human. It is likely that in many places, the two groups lived side by side for a time, a patchwork of cultures where Latin faded into Old English and Christianity retreated into the shadows as the smoke of pagan pyres rose into the sky. The Britons may have become second-class citizens, the Walha, or foreigners in their own land, the root of the word Welsh, eventually adopting the culture and language of the newcomers simply to survive and fit in. The geography of East Anglia played a crucial role in this transformation. The region is naturally isolated, cut off from the rest of England by the wide, marshy expanse of the fens to the west and the dense forests to the south. It is effectively an island, a cul-de-sac of the North Sea. This isolation allowed the Anglo culture to take root deeply and quickly, without too much interference from the chaos engulfing the rest of the island. The settlers moved up the river valleys, the Waveney, the Yare, the Orwell, the Deben, establishing farmsteads on the gravel terraces where the soil was dry and easy to plough. They weren't city builders. They looked at the ruins of Roman towns like Venta Icenorum, Caistor St. Edmund, and largely shunned them, preferring to build their timber halls and sunken featured buildings in the open countryside, close to the water and the woods. As the 5th century bled into the 6th, the memory of Rome became a myth. The stone roads were still there, used by the settlers' carts, but the people who had built them were thought of as a race of giants or magicians. The political structure of the region began to coalesce around small tribal groupings, likely based on extended families or charismatic warlords who could promise protection in uncertain times. We hear whisperings of names, the folk, that would eventually knit together. The North folk, Norfolk, and the South folk, Suffolk, a division that makes perfect geographic sense and has survived intact to this very day. It was a time of fluidity, a frontier society where status was determined not by imperial decree, but by how many cattle you owned, how many men you could call to your hall, and how much gold you could wear on your arm. The economy restarted, but on a smaller, more local scale. It was a barter economy based on grain, wool, slave trading, and the exchange of prestige gifts. The silence of the post-Roman collapse was being filled with the sounds of a new society. The scop reciting poetry in the mead hall, the clang of the smithy forging pattern-welded swords, and the lowing of oxen in the fields. This period, often dismissed as the Dark Ages, was in reality a time of vibrant, colorful reconstruction. The darkness is only in our lack of written records, not in the lives of the people. They wore bright clothes dyed with woad and madder. They crafted exquisite jewelry from amber and glass. They told stories of dragon slayers and gold hoarders that would eventually distill into the epic of Beowulf. The Angles were making this land their own, renaming the rivers, the hills, and the settlements. A farmstead by the water became a ham or a stun, suffixes that still dot the map today. They were laying the DNA of the English language and the English landscape. But as the settlements grew and the population expanded, the small tribal units inevitably began to rub up against one another. The age of the independent farmer-settler was giving way to the age of the petty king. Strong men began to absorb their weaker neighbors, forging larger territories through marriage, coercion, or the edge of a spear. In the misty, waterlogged heart of East Anglia, a particular lineage was beginning to rise above the rest, a family that claimed a lineage not just from great warriors of the past, but from the very gods themselves. They were the Woofingars, the people of the wolf, and they were about to drag East Anglia out of the tribal mists and onto the stage of history as a kingdom to be reckoned with. The vacuum left by the vanishing legions had been filled, and the northern tide had settled into a calm, deep pool, ready for the first great kings to cast their reflection upon it. The name itself carries a primal shiver, doesn't it? The Wolfingas, the people of the wolf. It is a dynastic title that feels less like a political party and more like a warning growled low in the throat, in the shadowy, half-lit genealogy of the early English kings, where history often blurs into myth. The Woofingers emerge from the marshes of Suffolk not just as rulers, but as apex predators. They didn't claim to be merely the strongest men in the room. They claimed to be the descendants of the god Woden himself, and further down the line, from a figure named Woofer, who supposedly ruled around 575 AD. Whether Woofer was a flesh and blood king who united the squabbling warbands, or simply a convenient ancestral totem created to scare the neighbors, is almost beside the point. The power lay in the story, and the story said that the kings of East Anglia had the blood of the wolf and the breath of the storm god in their veins. This new dynasty grounded itself in a specific, fiercely protected corner of the landscape, the Sandlings. This is the coastal strip of southeast Suffolk, a region of sandy heathland, gorse, and tidal estuaries that feels ancient even today. It was here, specifically in the valley of the River Deben, that the Woofingers built their power base. It wasn't a fortress of stone like the Romans would have built, but a landscape of authority. Recent archaeology, scratching beneath the surface of the quiet fields at Rendlesham, has revealed the sheer scale of their ambition. This wasn't just a farm. It was a royal complex, a vicus regius, spanning over 50 hectares. Imagine a great timber hall, the kind described in Beowulf, rising high above the river mist, its wooden beams carved with twisting serpents and creeping beasts, the roof gleaming in the pale sunlight. This was the heart-pumping blood into the infant kingdom, a place where tribute was collected, justice was dispensed, and the king sat on his high seat, distributing gold rings to his loyal thanes. The brilliance of the Woofingers lay in their ability to stitch together two distinct identities into a single political quilt. To the north of the rivers, Waveney and Little Ouse, lay the territory of the North folk, Norfolk. These were people living on the heavy clay soils and the chalk uplands, a dense, prosperous population of farmers. To the south, on the lighter soils, were the South folk, Suffolk. These two groups could easily have become separate, warring kingdoms, much like the petty states of the Middle Saxons or the Hwicce to the west. But the Woofingers, likely through a combination of strategic marriage, brute force, and the undeniable charisma of their wolf brand, managed to weld them together. They created a kingdom that was geographically coherent, bounded by the sea on two sides and the impenetrable fens on the third. It was a natural fortress, a little England within England, perfectly designed for a dynasty that wanted to grow fat and powerful in relative safety. There is a fascinating, lingering mystery about where these Woofingers actually came from before they washed up on the Suffolk coast, while they spoke a Germanic dialect like their neighbors in Wessex or Mercia. Their material culture, the things they held dear, the way they buried their dead, the helmets they wore, whispers of a different origin. They looked north, towards Scandinavia. The artifacts found in East Anglia from this period share an uncanny, almost identical DNA with the Vendel culture of eastern Sweden. The great helmets with their face masks, the shields, the specific style of animal art. It all points to a direct link with the Geats, the very people Beowulf belonged to. It is entirely possible that the Wolfingas were an offshoot of a Swedish royal house, exiled adventurers who crossed the North Sea to carve out a new realm, bringing their epic poetry and their dragon-proud aesthetic with them. They were Vikings before the Viking Age, seemingly more at home with the rhythm of the waves than the stillness of the deep woods. Under the rule of Wuffa's son, Titler, who reigned in the late 6th century, this kingdom began to flex its muscles. Titler is a shadowy figure, a name in a list, but he must have been a formidable operator. He is the one who likely solidified the borders, pushing westwards against the rising power of the Middle Angles, testing the waters, seeing how far the wolf's territory could extend. He was ruling in a time of violent flux, where a king's life expectancy was usually measured in how fast he could draw his sword. Yet Titler managed to pass his kingdom intact to his son, a feat of stability that was rare enough to be remarkable. He left behind a realm that was wealthy, thanks to the rich agricultural land and the trade routes that crisscrossed the North Sea, connecting the Deben to the Rhine and beyond. This wealth wasn't just hoarded, it was displayed. The Wolfingas understood the theater of power. They knew that to be a king, you had to look like something other than a man. You had to glitter. The jewelry produced in East Anglia during this time is some of the finest ever made in Europe. Garnet cloisonné work, where thin slices of red gemstone were set into gold cells with a precision that defies the naked eye. These weren't just ornaments. They were political statements, blindingly bright evidence that the wearer controlled the trade routes that brought garnets from India and gold from the continent. When a Wolfinga king walked into his hall, the firelight catching the red and gold on his shoulders and belt, he would have looked like a being composed of fire and light, a visual echo of the gods he claimed as ancestors. But the Wolfingas were also navigating a changing spiritual landscape. While they proudly traced their line to Woden, the winds from the south and the west were carrying a new scent, the incense of Christianity. To the south, the Kingdom of Kent had already welcomed Augustine and his Roman missionaries. The old gods, the Thundermakers and the Wolf Fathers, were about to face their greatest challenge, not from a battlefield rival, but from a man on a donkey. The tension between the old ways of the northern forests and the new ways of the Roman book was beginning to simmer. The Wolfingas, with their Swedish roots and their deep investment in the pagan ideology of warrior kingship, would find themselves at the very center of this collision. By the time Titler died, around 599 AD, the stage was set for East Anglia's golden age. The foundations had been dug deep into the clay and sand. The North folk and South folk were united under one banner. The royal treasury was bursting with the fruits of trade and tribute. The people of the Wolf had established themselves as one of the premier dynasties of the Heptarchy, the 7 great kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England. But they were still, in many ways, a regional power, a strong dog in a medium-sized yard. It would take the next king, a man of profound complexity, ambition, and perhaps a little spiritual confusion, to take the Wolfingas from the marshes of Suffolk to the very pinnacle of power in Britain. The wolf was about to step out of the den and cast a shadow that would stretch all the way to the Humber. If Titler was the man who built the house of the Woffingas, his son, Raedwald, was the one who gilded the roof and installed a throne that looked down on everyone else in the neighborhood. Raedwald is one of those figures in history who feels startlingly modern, a pragmatic, slippery, powerful operator who understood that in the Game of Thrones, rigid ideology often gets you killed, while flexibility gets you an empire. He ruled from around 519 to 624 AD, and for that brief, glittering quarter century, the center of gravity in Britain didn't lie in London or Winchester or York, but right here, in the sandy heaths of Suffolk. He was the Bretwalda, a term that literally translates to Britain ruler or wide ruler. It meant he was the boss, the capo dei capi of the Anglo-Saxon world, holding imperium over all the English provinces south of the River Humber. When Redwald spoke, other kings didn't just listen. They brought gifts and hoped he was in a good mood. But Raedwald is perhaps most famous for being the ultimate spiritual fence-sitter. He is the patron saint of hedging one's bets. Early in his reign, he traveled down to Kent, the first kingdom to officially adopt Christianity, and accepted baptism. It was a smart diplomatic move, aligning him with the powerful kingdom of Kent and, by extension, the prestige of Rome and the Franks across the Channel. But when he got back home to East Anglia, he didn't exactly start tearing down the old shrines. According to the Venerable Bede, our primary source for all this gossip, Raedwald set up a temple with two altars, one dedicated to the sacrifice of Christ, and another, smaller one right next to it, dedicated to the demons, the old Germanic gods of his ancestors. You can almost see the logic, can't you? Why risk annoying Woden, the god of war and kingship, just because you've made a new friend in Jesus? It was a theological insurance policy. If one god failed to answer his prayers, he could simply turn slightly to the left and try the other one. His wife, a formidable woman whose name history has criminally forgotten, was apparently a staunch pagan and likely encouraged this dual worship, reminding him that it was the wolf gods, not the carpenter, who had brought the Woffingas to power. This domestic tension between the old ways and the new serves as a backdrop to the great political drama of Raedwald's life, a story that plays out like a noir thriller involving a hunted man, a bribe, and a queen with a spine of steel. The hunted man was Edwin of Northumbria. Edwin was a prince in exile, fleeing the wrath of Ethelfrith, the terrifying king of Northumbria, who was systematically hunting down rival claimants to secure his own throne. Edwin had spent years wandering through the kingdoms of Britain, a majestic beggar, always looking over his shoulder. Eventually, he washed up at Raedwald's court in East Anglia, asking for sanctuary. Raedwald, enjoying the prestige of sheltering such a high-value guest, took him in, promising him protection. But Ethelfrith was not a man who took no for an answer. He sent messengers to Raedwald with a simple offer: kill Edwin or hand him over, and receive a massive pile of gold. If Raedwald refused, the gold would be replaced by war. Raedwald stalled. The messengers came back a second time, with more gold and louder threats. Then a third time. Raedwald, the pragmatist, began to wobble. He was a politician, and the calculus was simple. Ethelfrith was dangerous and far away. Edwin was helpless and right there. Why risk his kingdom for a stray prince? He reportedly decided to betray his guest, planning to either kill Edwin or surrender him to the Northumbrian executioners. This is where Raedwald's wife steps out of the shadows and changes the course of English history. She confronted her husband, perhaps in the privacy of the royal bedchamber, or maybe in the great hall itself, and delivered a stinging rebuke. She told him that it was beneath the dignity of a great king to sell his honor for gold, and that betraying a guest who had been promised protection was an act of cowardice that would stain his name forever. It worked. Raedwald, shamed by his queen, and perhaps realizing that bowing to Ethelfrith would only make him look weak, did a complete 180. He didn't just refuse the bribe, he decided to strike first. In 616 AD, Raedwald gathered the full might of East Anglia. He didn't wait for Ethelfrith to come south. He marched his army north, moving with a speed that caught the Northumbrians completely off guard. They met at the River Idle, near the border of Mercia and Northumbria. It was a messy, brutal engagement fought in the mud and the reeds. The East Anglian army was fresh and larger, having caught Ethelfrith before he could fully assemble his own forces. But the Northumbrian king was a veteran warlord, and he fought like a cornered animal. In the initial clash, Raedwald's son, Regenher, was cut down. It was a heavy price, a personal tragedy in the midst of political triumph. But Raedwald pressed the advantage. Ethelfrith was killed in the fighting, and his army shattered. The Battle of the River Idle was a geopolitical earthquake. In one afternoon, Raedwald had eliminated the only other superpower in Britain. He placed his protege, Edwin, on the throne of Northumbria, effectively turning the northern kingdom into a client state. Now, Raedwald's influence stretched from the English Channel all the way to the Scottish borders. He was the undisputed master of the island. The tribute flowed south: cattle, slaves, silver, and gold, swelling the coffers of the Woofingars to bursting point. The remainder of Raedwald's reign was a golden afternoon of peace and prosperity, maintained by the threat of his victorious army. He sat in his great hall at Rendlesham, a king of kings, surrounded by the finest craftsmen, poets, and warriors in the Germanic world. He was a cosmopolitan ruler, a man who wore Roman-style shoulder clasps, but likely drank mead from the horns of wild aurochs. He had proven that East Anglia was not just a foggy backwater, but the spear tip of Anglo-Saxon culture. When Raedwald finally died around 624 AD, the question of how to bury such a colossus must have consumed the court. A normal grave in the earth wouldn't do. A simple cremation urn was insufficient for a man who had touched the sky. They needed a statement. They needed to send him to the next world with the same overwhelming majesty he had commanded in this one. They looked to the river, to the great ships that were the lifeblood of their connection to the wider world. They chose the finest vessel in the royal fleet, a 90-foot clinker-built beauty, and dragged it laboriously up the cliff from the River Deben to the burial ground at Sutton Hoo. It is almost certain, though history loves to keep a tiny sliver of doubt, that the great ship burial at Sutton Hoo is Raedwald's tomb. The dating fits, the richness fits, and the symbolism fits. The mix of Christian and pagan artifacts in the grave mirrors perfectly the man who kept two altars. The silver bowls from Byzantium speak of his reach. The great gold buckle speaks of his wealth. And the helmet, with its iron mask and silver eyebrows, speaks of the face he presented to the world. Unreadable, fierce, and magnificent. Raedwald's death marked the end of the high zenith of East Anglian power. Never again would a king of the East Angles hold the title of Bretwalda. The center of power would shift away, first to Northumbria, then to Mercia, and finally to Wessex. But for that one shining moment, under the rule of the man who hedged his bets with the gods and gambled everything on a battle at a river crossing, East Anglia was the center of the world. He left his people with a memory of greatness that would linger for centuries, a golden standard against which all future kings would be measured and found wanting. The wolf had feasted, and now he was ready to sleep in his ship of wood and iron, waiting for the tides of time to cover him over. When the archaeologists brushed away the final layers of sandy soil in the summer of 1939, they weren't just uncovering a grave. They were opening a window into a world that had been dark for 13 centuries. The treasure of Sutton Hoo is so famous now, so ubiquitous on postcards and history book covers, that it's easy to become numb to it. We see the helmet, we nod, and we move on. But stop for a moment and really let the weight of this hoard sink in. This wasn't a savings account left behind by accident. This was a deliberate, colossal act of disposal. The people who buried this king, Redwald, or perhaps another great Woffinga lord, took the equivalent of the national treasury, the finest works of art their civilization could produce, and shoved them into the ground. It was the ultimate power move. It said to the world and to the gods, "We are so wealthy, so powerful, and so overflowing with gold that we can afford to throw this away. Let's step inside that burial chamber, reconstructing it in our minds before the wooden roof groaned and collapsed under the weight of the mound." The first thing that would have caught your eye in the gloom was the helmet. It is the face of the early Middle Ages. Before its discovery, we tended to think of the Anglo-Saxons as somewhat scruffy, bearded farmers living in drafty huts. The helmet shattered that illusion instantly. It is a masterpiece of iron and tinned bronze, a work of terrifying beauty. The face mask is frozen in a permanent, stoic snarl, but look closer at the nose and the mouth. It's a visual puzzle. The nose, eyebrows, and mustache form the image of a dragon or a bird of prey flying upwards, its wings spreading out to become the eyebrows, its tail the mustache. It is a dual image, a visual pun wrought in metal. This isn't just armor, it's poetry in iron. It tells us that the man who wore it wasn't just a soldier. He was a shapeshifter, a dragon man, a figure who inhabited both the human world and the mythic realm of beasts. The design links directly back to the Vendel helmets of Sweden, that undeniable fingerprint of the Woffingas' Scandinavian origins. Resting near the helmet was the shield, or what remained of it. The wood had rotted away, but the heavy metal fittings remained in place like a constellation of power. The central boss was decorated with aggressive, predatory birds, and the shield itself was likely an heirloom, already old when it went into the ground. But it is the jewelry that truly stops the heart. The great gold buckle is a slab of solid gold weighing over 400 grams. It is covered in yellow, a black sulfur mixture, and carved with such intricate, interweaving snakes and beasts that you need a magnifying glass to trace their paths. It is a labyrinth of gold, designed to lock the king's belt, the symbolic center of his strength. Even more exquisite are the shoulder clasps. These are two curved, hinged pieces of gold designed to hold a leather cuirass together at the shoulders, much like a Roman emperor's ceremonial armor. This is a deliberate stylistic choice. The Wofingas were dressing their king up as a Roman general, appropriating the authority of the fallen empire. But the decoration is pure Germanic genius. The clasps are inlaid with hundreds of tiny, perfectly cut garnets. The craftsmanship is almost impossible to replicate today. The smiths didn't just set the stones, they placed purely decorative, waffle-stamped gold foil behind each garnet. Why? So that when the light hit the red stone, it would pass through, hit the textured gold, and bounce back, making the gems glow from within like living embers. It was early special effects technology, designed to make the king shine with a supernatural radiance in the dim light of the mead hall. Among the garnets, there is a distinct use of millefiori glass, blue and white checkered glass rods fused together and sliced like a stick of rock candy. This technique was a Celtic survival, a skill held by the native British craftsmen. So, on these shoulder clasps, we see the physical fusion of the two worlds, the Germanic garnet work and the British glasswork, bound together in gold. It is a perfect metaphor for the kingdom of East Anglia itself, a hybrid culture, wealthy, artistic, and deeply connected to the past. But the hoard isn't just about local power. It's a map of the known world. We find a set of 10 silver bowls nestled together. When cleaned, they revealed a stamp from the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Anastasius III, who ruled in Constantinople a century before the burial. How did silver from the humid, incense-heavy court of Byzantium end up in a sandy grave in Suffolk? It speaks of a trade network that defied the chaos of the Dark Ages, a relay race of gifts and exchanges that moved luxury goods from the Mediterranean, up the Rhine, across the North Sea, and into the hands of the Wofingas. There were also 2 silver spoons, inscribed in Greek with the names Saulos and Paulos, Saul and Paul. These are likely christening spoons, a nod to the conversion, perhaps a gift from the Pope or a Frankish bishop to the wavering King Redwald. They sit there in the grave, surrounded by pagan symbols, a testament to that spiritual hedging we talked about. And then there is the strangest object of all, the whetstone. It is a heavy 4-sided bar of stone, tapering at the ends, topped with a bronze stag. It looks like a tool for sharpening swords, but it has no signs of wear. It is pristine. Carved onto each of the 4 faces are human heads, stern, bearded, ancestral faces. This is a scepter, a symbol of royal authority, but of a very specific, ancient kind. It represents the king not as a warrior, but as the sharpener of his people, the hard stone against which the kingdom is honed. It is a heavy, brutal, magnificent object that feels like it belongs to a druid as much as a king. It suggests a role for the monarch that is priestly, shamanistic, connected to the deep earth and the ancestors. Scattered amongst these high-status items were the personal effects that make the ghost of the king feel human. There was a lyre, a 6-stringed instrument made of maple wood kept in a beaver skin bag. We can imagine the king passing this harp around the fire, reciting the lines of Beowulf or the Wofinga genealogy, his voice mingling with the smoke. There were gaming pieces made of bone, suggesting a love for strategy and leisure. There were drinking horns, huge ones, made from the horns of the aurochs, the giant extinct wild cattle of Europe. To drink from such a horn was a feat of masculinity. You couldn't put it down until it was empty, or the contents would spill. It implies a culture of feasting, of competitive drinking, of boisterous nights while the winter wind howled outside. And finally, the coins. In a purse with a gold lid, intricately decorated with images of a man wrestling two wolves, a Woffinger family crest perhaps, lay 37 gold coins, 3 blank flans, and 2 small ingots. These coins were all Merovingian tremisses from Francia. The specific dates of these coins are the primary reason we can date the burial to around 625 AD. But why 37? It's an odd number. A popular theory suggests that these were not money to be spent in the afterlife shops, but the wages for the ghostly crew. A great ship needs oarsmen. There were 40 oarports on the Sutton Hoo ship. If you count the king, the 2 ingots, perhaps for the steersman and the lookout, and the 37 coins, you have a full crew manifest. Even in death, the king was expected to travel with a retinue, rowing his soul across the dark waters to the land of the ancestors. The Sutton Hoo treasure forces us to rewrite the script of English history. It tells us that East Anglia in the early 7th century wasn't a barbarian backwater. It was a high-functioning, sophisticated, cosmopolitan state. Its rulers had the wealth to commission the finest jewelers in Europe, the connections to acquire silver from Constantinople and cloth from Syria, and the cultural confidence to blend pagan and Christian, Germanic and British into a unique, glittering style. When the soil was thrown over that ship, bearing the gold and the garnets, it preserved a moment of peak civilization. It was a time capsule from the age of the Woffingers, sealed tight against the worms and the rot, waiting to remind us that the Dark Ages were actually filled with a blazing golden light. The death of Redwald didn't just leave an empty throne. It left a spiritual vacuum that sucked the kingdom into a vortex of violence and confusion. His son, Eorpwald, inherited the crown, but he seemingly lacked his father's talent for walking the tightrope between the old gods and the new. Raedwald had been a master of ambiguity, keeping everyone happy by nodding to Woden while smiling at Christ. Eorpwald, however, was pushed into a corner by the very man his father had saved. Edwin of Northumbria. Edwin, now the most powerful king in Britain, thanks to East Anglian blood spilled at the River Idle, was a zealous convert to Christianity. He leaned hard on his old allies to follow suit, effectively telling Eorpwald to get with the program or face the consequences. Eorpwald, likely seeing the political writing on the wall, agreed. He accepted baptism, officially bringing East Anglia into the fold of the church. But in the 7th century, religion wasn't a private matter of the heart. It was a political allegiance, and to the traditionalist warrior aristocracy of Suffolk, abandoning the war gods for a pacifist carpenter looked a lot like surrendering their sovereignty to Northumbria. The reaction was swift and brutal. Shortly after his conversion, Eorpwald was assassinated. He wasn't killed in battle. He was murdered by a man named Ricbert, a pagan hardliner who likely saw himself as a patriot saving the kingdom from foreign spiritual imperialism. For the next 3 years, East Anglia plunged back into the dark. Ricbert is one of those fascinating ghosts of history. We know nothing about him other than his name and his deed. He doesn't appear on the official regnal lists, treated by later Christian chroniclers like a bad memory they tried to repress. But for 3 years, the altars to Christ were likely smashed, the wooden crosses burned, and the smoke of animal sacrifices once again drifted up from the sacred groves of the Sandlings. It was the last defiant roar of the old ways, a desperate attempt to turn back the clock to the days when a king's power was measured by the sharpness of his axe, not the piety of his prayers. But the tide of history is hard to swim against. The pagan restoration ended with the return of Sigebert. Sigebert was Raedwald's stepson, or perhaps a brother. The genealogy gets a bit murky here. Who had been driven into exile in Gaul during the treacherous years of family infighting. While in Gaul, living among the Franks, Sigebert hadn't just been biding his time. He had been studying. He was a new kind of creature in the Anglo-Saxon bestiary, a scholar king. He came back to East Anglia, not just with a sword, but with a library in his head and a deep, genuine commitment to the Christian faith. He didn't want to just rule his people. He wanted to educate them. He saw Christianity not as a political tool, but as a system of civilization, a way to bring Roman order to the chaotic, muddy reality of the fens. Sigebert knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed a spiritual general to lead the campaign for souls. He found him in a man named Felix. Felix was a bishop from Burgundy, a sophisticated, organized Roman cleric who had volunteered for the dangerous mission of converting the English. Sigebert installed Felix as the first bishop of the East Angles, giving him a see at a place called Domok. Today, Domok is a ghost place. Most historians agree it was likely Dunwich, a city that was once the bustling capital of the region, a medieval metropolis with churches, wharves, and shipyards. But the North Sea is a cruel neighbor. Over the centuries, the soft cliffs have crumbled away, and Dunwich has been swallowed almost entirely by the waves. The cathedral where Felix preached, the bones of the early saints, the streets where Sigebert walked, they are all out there, somewhere under the cold grey water, a literal Atlantis of the East Anglian Church. Felix went to work with the efficiency of a civil servant. He set up schools to teach the local boys to read and write Latin, importing teachers from Kent to ensure the curriculum was up to scratch. This was revolutionary stuff. Before this, knowledge in East Anglia was oral, passed down by scops and elders. Now, it was being written down on parchment. Felix was the apostle of the East Angles, a man of structure, rules, and Roman discipline. He represented the Peter side of the church, the rock, the institution, the hierarchy. But the East Anglian conversion had a wilder, more mystical side too, arriving not from the orderly south, but from the untamed west. While Felix was building his schools, an Irish monk named Fursey arrived in the kingdom. Fursey was a product of the Celtic Church, which was a very different beast from the Roman one. The Celtic monks didn't care much for hierarchy or comfortable bishops' palaces. They sought God in the wilderness, in the hardship of the elements, in the white martyrdom of exile. Fursey was a visionary, a man who fell into trances and saw terrifying glimpses of the afterlife. Angels and demons fighting over souls, great fires consuming the world. He was intense, charismatic, and probably a little bit frightening to the average Suffolk farmer. Sigebert, showing a remarkable broad-mindedness, welcomed Fursey too. He gave the Irishman an old Roman shore fort in which to build his monastery. This was Canobairsburg, almost certainly the ruins of Burgh Castle in Norfolk. Imagine the scene. A small community of Irish monks with their tonsures cut from ear to ear. The Celtic style, which looked bizarre to the Romans, building their humble timber huts inside the massive, brooding flint walls of a deserted Roman fortress. They were living in the skeleton of a dead empire, singing psalms to the sound of the wind whipping off the marshes. Percy didn't govern. He prayed, he fasted, and he preached a raw, elemental version of the faith that likely resonated deeply with the people living in such a harsh landscape. So, you had this dual pincer movement on the pagan soul of East Anglia. On the coast at Dunwich, you had Felix with his Roman vestments and his grammar schools, bringing order and literacy. In the Roman ruins at Berg Castle, you had Percy with his visions and his asceticism, bringing mystery and spiritual fire. Slowly, the saints in the swamps began to win. The landscape started to change. Wooden minsters began to rise on the islands in the fens, places like Ely and Crowland, which were effectively holy fortresses surrounded by water. To travel to these places, you had to take a punt through the labyrinth of reeds and waterways, a journey that felt like crossing into another world. The Fenland became a desert for the hermits, a place where you could be alone with God, tormented only by the mosquitoes and the damp ague. Sigebert himself became so enamored with the monastic ideal that he did something unthinkable for a Germanic warrior king. He quit after a few years of rule. He decided that the burden of kingship, with its constant demands for violence and judgment, was endangering his soul. He abdicated the throne, handing the crown to his kinsman Eccric, and retired to a monastery, possibly the one at Beodricksworth, modern Bury St. Edmunds. He cut his long hair, traded his sword for a cowl, and prepared to spend the rest of his life in prayer. It was a shocking move. In a culture where a king was the ring-giver and the shield of his people, for a king to voluntarily become a monk was almost a dereliction of duty. But it showed just how deeply the new faith had sunk its claws into the Woffinger dynasty. However, the political reality of 7th century England didn't care about Sigebert's desire for peace. While East Anglia was busy building churches and copying gospels, a storm was brewing in the west. The kingdom of Mercia, under its ferocious pagan king Penda, was rising. Penda was a throwback, a man who had no time for the soft religion of the cross. He saw East Anglia not as a sister kingdom, but as a wealthy, weak neighbor ripe for the picking. The peace of the cloister was about to be shattered by the sound of splintering wood and screaming men. Sigebert, the king who wanted to be a monk, was about to find out that you can abdicate a throne, but you cannot easily abdicate your destiny, especially when that destiny involves a pagan warlord who wants to burn your monastery to the ground. The conversion had begun. The cross had been planted in the soil, but it was about to be watered with a significant amount of royal blood. The saints were in the swamps, but the wolves were at the door. If you were a betting man in the 7th century, the smart money was always on Penda. The king of Mercia was a force of nature, a bearded, brawling, unrepentant pagan who viewed the spread of Christianity across England with the same suspicion a wolf might view a trap. He ruled the Midlands, a vast, undefined territory that seemingly expanded every time he decided to go for a walk with his army. To the East Anglians, tucked away in their corner of the island, Penda wasn't just a neighbor. He was a nightmare waiting to happen. The Woffingers had spent decades building a kingdom based on trade, high culture, and intricate jewelry. Penda built a kingdom based on the simple, brutal arithmetic of the shield wall. It was an inevitable collision, a clash not just of armies, but of ideologies. the refined, Christianized coast versus the raw, heathen heartland. The crisis came in the mid-630s AD. Penda, sensing weakness after Sigebert's abdication, turned his hungry gaze eastward. King Ecgric, the man left holding the bag after Sigebert retired to his monastery, found himself hopelessly outmatched. The Mercian army was a veteran machine, hardened by years of border raids against the Welsh and the Northumbrians. The East Anglian Fyrd, the militia raised from the farms and villages, was spirited but brittle. As the Mercian warbands began to burn the border settlements, rolling up the defences like a carpet, panic seized the East Anglian court. They knew Ecgric couldn't hold the line alone. They needed a talisman. They needed the man who had brought them the new god and the old luck. They needed Sigebert. The scene that followed is one of the most tragic and surreal in English history. A delegation of terrified nobles rode to the monastery at Beodricksworth, banging on the doors and demanding to see their former king. They found Sigebert in his cell, perhaps on his knees, his mind miles away from the blood and mud of the battlefield. They begged him to come out, to lead the army, to let the soldiers see his face. They believed that his presence alone would put steel into the spines of the troops. But Sigebert refused. He had taken vows. He was a soldier of Christ now, forbidden to shed blood or bear arms. He told them, effectively, to go away and let him pray. But the nobles were desperate, and desperate men don't take no for an answer. In a shocking breach of protocol and religious sanctuary, they physically dragged the former king out of the cloister. Imagine the chaos: the shouting men, the protesting monks, the bewildered ex-king in his rough wool habit, blinking in the sunlight, being hoisted onto a horse he didn't want to ride. It was a kidnapping of their own sovereign. They marched him to the front lines, a living standard, a reluctant mascot for a doomed army. Sigebert, however, remained true to his new self to the bitter end. He refused to strap on a sword or pick up a shield. Instead, he rode into battle carrying only a simple wooden staff, perhaps a walking stick or a symbol of his pastoral care. The battle was a massacre. Penda's Mercians, likely laughing at the sight of a monk trying to stop a tidal wave with a twig, tore through the East Anglian lines. The result was catastrophic. Both King Ecgric and the monk king Sigebert were cut down in the slaughter. The East Anglian army was shattered, and the Wulfgar dynasty was nearly decapitated in a single afternoon. It was a brutal lesson in the realities of realpolitik. Faith might save your soul, but against a wall of Mercian iron, you really need a spear. Penda marched home loaded with plunder, leaving East Anglia mourning two kings and wondering if their god had abandoned them. But the Wulfgars were nothing if not resilient. From the wreckage of the defeat emerged a new king, Anna. He was the nephew of Redwald, a man who seems to have possessed a spine made of pure granite. Anna is one of the unsung heroes of the era, a man who spent his entire reign, spanning over a decade, serving as the breakwater against the Mercian tide. He was a devout Christian, arguably even more so than Sigebert, but he understood that protecting the faith meant fighting for it. He rebuilt the army, refortified the dikes that guarded the western approaches, and turned his court into a sanctuary for exiles fleeing Penda's wrath. For a while, Anna managed to hold his own. He played the diplomatic game expertly, marrying his daughters into other royal houses to weave a web of alliances against Mercia. He even sheltered Cenwalh, the King of Wessex, when Penda drove him out of his own lands. This was a bold, dangerous move. Harboring Penda's enemies was a surefire way to invite Penda back for a return visit. But Anna seems to have been driven by a rigid moral compass. He was the good king standing up to the bad king, a narrative that the church chroniclers loved to polish. Penda, however, had a long memory and very little patience for moral defiance. In 651 AD, he decided he had had enough of the stubborn East Anglian resistance. He launched another massive invasion, pushing deep into the heart of the kingdom. The target this time was the monastery at Knobiusberg, the place founded by the Irish mystic Furcy. Penda's troops sacked it, scattering the monks and stealing the treasures. It was a direct attack on the spiritual infrastructure of the kingdom. Anna arrived too late to save the monastery, but he managed to check the Mercian advance, fighting a delaying action that bought his people some time. But the end was written in the stars, or perhaps in the sheer disparity of numbers. In 653 or 654 AD, the final act of the tragedy played out at the Battle of Bulkamp, near Blithburg in Suffolk. The location is haunting, a place of reeds, tidal mud, and screaming seabirds. Penda arrived with a force that was likely bolstered by Welsh allies and subject kings. Anna, accompanied by his son, German, met him on the field. We don't have the tactical details, but we know the outcome. The East Anglian shield wall, hammered by the superior weight of the Mercian host, eventually buckled and broke. King Anna and Prince German were slaughtered. The death of Anna was the breaking point. With his demise, East Anglia effectively ceased to be an independent power player. It became a vassal state, a tributary province under the heavy thumb of Mercia. Penda installed a puppet king, Ethelhere, Anna's own brother, who had apparently decided that joining the winning team was safer than dying like the rest of his family. Ethelhere was a collaborator, a man who agreed to fight for Penda rather than against him. It was a humiliating come-down for the proud lineage of the Wuffingas. The wolf people were now the lapdogs of the Midlands. Yet, history has a strange sense of humor. Penda, the great pagan destroyer, the man who had killed 3 East Anglian kings, Sigebert, Ecgric, and Anna, and 1 Northumbrian king, Edwin, met his own end just a year later at the Battle of the Windward. And who was there, fighting at his side? Ethelhere of East Anglia, the puppet king. In a chaotic, rain-soaked battle that saw the river swell and drown as many men as the swords did, both Penda and Ethelhere were killed. Penda's death marked the effective end of aggressive paganism in England, and the end of the Mercian stranglehold. At least for a moment, the Mercian wars left deep scars on the East Anglian psyche. The landscape was dotted with the burial mounds of kings who had died defending the borders. The monasteries had been burned and rebuilt. But beneath the political humiliation, something strange was happening. The martyrdom of these kings, Sigebert with his staff, Anna with his pious resistance, had created a potent spiritual legacy. They had lost the war for land, but they were winning the war for memory. The soil of East Anglia was now considered holy, watered by the blood of royal saints. This spiritual prestige began to detach itself from political power. You didn't need to be the strongest kingdom to be the holiest. In the quiet aftermath of the wars, while the farmers went back to their fields and the new puppet kings paid their tribute to whoever was currently sitting on the Mercian throne, The real power in East Anglia began to shift. It moved away from the mead halls and the battlefields and into the cloisters. The daughters of King Anna, seeing the futility of worldly power and the violent ends of their father and brothers, turned their backs on the court. They didn't become queens, they became abbesses, and in doing so, they launched a different kind of golden age, one built not on gold buckles and garnet fittings, but on stone, prayer, and the draining of the fens. The wolves were tired of fighting. It was time for the nuns to take over. The dust had barely settled on the battlefield where King Anna fell before a strange and quiet transformation began to take hold of East Anglia. Usually, when a dynasty is crushed in battle, the survivors are rounded up, executed, or married off into obscurity. But the Woofingers pulled off a remarkable second act. They realized that if they couldn't beat the Mercians with swords, they would outlast them with holiness. The sons of the house had largely been butchered, but the daughters of King Anna were still standing, and they were about to become the most formidable spiritual heavyweights in England. This was the dawn of the Age of Minsters, a time when the landscape was colonized not by farmers or soldiers, but by nuns who built fortresses of prayer in the most inhospitable corners of the kingdom. The superstar of this new era was Ethelthryth, better known to history as Saint Etheldreda, or the even friendlier Audrey. Her life reads like a rebellious teenager's diary written by a mystic. She was a pawn in the high-stakes game of marriage alliances, traded first to a prince of the Middle Angles, and later to the powerful King Ecgfrith of Northumbria. In both cases, the political logic was sound. Bind the surrounding kingdoms to East Anglia through marriage to keep the wolves at bay. But Etheldreda had a different plan, despite being married twice. She famously and stubbornly refused to consummate either union. She had taken a private vow of virginity, and no amount of royal pressure or husbandly complaining could budge her. It was a form of passive resistance that baffled the warrior kings of the age. They could conquer territories, but they couldn't conquer the will of this one East Anglian princess. Her eventual escape from her Northumbrian husband is the stuff of legend. She fled south, pursued by the king, scrambling over the rocky headlands and hiding in the tide. When she finally made it back to her homeland, she didn't head for the comfort of the royal hall at Rendlesham. She went to the fens. Specifically, she went to a place called Elger, or Ely, the island of eels. In the 7th century, Ely wasn't just a town. It was a fortress of solitude, a patch of high clay ground rising out of a vast, impassable soup of black water and reeds. It was accessible only by boat or causeway, a place where the fog clung to the ground until noon, and the silence was broken only by the cry of the bittern. It was here, in 673 AD, that Etheldreda founded her double monastery, a community for both monks and nuns, ruled over by her as the abbess. The founding of Ely was a declaration of independence, not from Mercia, but from the world itself. Etheldreda used her immense personal wealth, her dowry lands, to build a church that would rival anything in the south. We have to imagine the logistics of this. Stone had to be barged in through the winding waterways, timber dragged across the marshes. It was a construction project that defied the landscape, and it worked. Ely became a magnet. It attracted the pious, the broken, and the royal. It became a sanctuary where the laws of kings stopped at the water's edge. Etheldreda ruled there like a spiritual queen, wielding a staff instead of a scepter. And when she died, of a plague that caused a tumor on her neck, which she gratefully accepted as penance for wearing too many necklaces in her youth. Her cult exploded. She became the most popular female saint in medieval England, a figure of such immense gravity that pilgrims flocked to her shrine for centuries, buying cheap lace necklaces called St. Audrey's lace, the origin of our modern word, tawdry. While Ethelreda was turning Ely into a holy island, the political map was shifting in the west. The territory known as the Middle Angles, roughly modern-day Leicestershire and Northamptonshire, had long been a buffer zone between East Anglia and Mercia. In the days of Raedwald, the East Anglian kings had treated this area as their backyard. But after the disasters of the Mercian Wars, the grip slipped. The Middle Angles were absorbed into the Mercian orbit, not necessarily by conquest, but by gravity. Mercia was simply the bigger, heavier planet. Bender's son, Piada, was installed as ruler there, and the region became a sub-kingdom of the Mercian hegemony. However, even as East Anglia lost political control of the Middle Angles, it won the cultural war. The conversion of the Middle Angles was largely driven by East Anglian missionaries and connections. The priests who walked the muddy tracks of the Midlands, baptizing farmers in the rivers, were often trained in the schools founded by Felix or influenced by the monasticism of Fursi. It was a soft power victory. The Mercians might collect the taxes, but the East Anglians were saving the souls. This created a peculiar dynamic where the borders were porous. A man might pay rent to a Mercian lord, but look to an East Anglian saint for protection. This era also saw the rise of a new kind of settlement, the minster. The word comes from the Latin monasterium, but in the Anglo-Saxon landscape, a minster wasn't just a place for monks to hide away. It was a mission station. These were large, staffed churches that served a huge area, sending out priests on horseback to preach in the remote hamlets. In East Anglia, minsters sprang up at strategic points: South Elmham, North Elmham, Hoxne, and Bury. They were the administrative hubs of the new religion, often built on or near old royal estates. The Wuffinger kings, now lacking the military muscle to expand their borders, turned their energy inward, investing in this infrastructure. If they couldn't be the emperors of Britain, they would be the patrons of the church. The kings who ruled during this twilight period, men like Ealdwulf, who reigned for an incredible 49 years from 664 to 713 AD, are often dismissed as boring because they didn't start any major wars. But in the early Middle Ages, boring was a supreme compliment. It meant stability. Ealdwulf was a contemporary of the great writers Bede and Aldhelm, and he seems to have presided over a long Indian summer of peace. He accepted his status as a lesser king, acknowledging the overlordship of the Mercian rulers. But he managed to keep his kingdom intact. He didn't rebel, he didn't provoke, and consequently, his people didn't die in burning thatched huts. Under Ealdwulf's steady hand, the economy of East Anglia began to mutate. The old gift-giving economy of the heroic age, where a king handed out gold rings to keep his warriors loyal, was slowly being replaced by something more recognizable: trade. On the banks of the River Orwell, a new settlement was growing. They called it Gippswick, modern Ipswich. It wasn't much to look at initially, just a collection of workshops and wharves. But it was the future. This was the kingdom's emporium, the gateway to the North Sea. Pottery kilns were firing up, producing a gritty, practical grey ware known as Ipswich ware that would soon be found in kitchens all over England. Frisian merchants were docking their cog ships, unloading wine from the Rhineland and millstones from the Eifel Mountains. This shift from the hall to the market is crucial. The Woofingers had started as warlords in great timber halls like Rendlesham. Now, they were becoming landlords and toll collectors for the bustling port of Ipswich. The center of gravity was moving from the display of wealth to the generation of wealth. The gold wasn't going into graves anymore. The age of Sutton Hoo was over. The gold was going into the church and into circulation. The coins were smaller, silver sciatas, ugly little things compared to the gold tremisses of the past. But there were thousands of them. It was the democratization of money. But even as the kilns of Ipswich fired and the nuns of Ely chanted, the shadows were lengthening. The stability of Ealdwulf's long reign masked a structural weakness. East Anglia was small. It was rich, yes, and holy, certainly, but it lacked the strategic depth of Mercia or Northumbria. It was a cul-de-sac. As the 8th century dawned, the giants of the Heptarchy were getting hungrier. The Mercian kings were no longer content with just being overlords. They wanted to be emperors. The buffer of the Middle Angles was gone, fully digested into the Mercian belly. East Anglia was now sharing a direct, uncomfortable border with a superpower that viewed it less as a kingdom and more as a convenient bank account. The Age of the Saints had bought East Anglia a reprieve. The spiritual fortress of Ely and the reputation of the Woofinger martyrs had acted as a kind of force field, making aggressors hesitate before striking. But sanctity is a perishable shield. New kings were rising in the Midlands who cared less about the wrath of St. Etheldreda and more about the silver flowing through the docks of Ipswich. The Middle Angles had fallen. The minsters were rich and undefended. The wolves of the Woofingers were old and toothless, and a new pack was gathering in the west, led by a man who would redefine what it meant to be a king of the English. The peace of the minsters was about to be broken by the clatter of a minting machine and the march of an army that didn't just want tribute, it wanted total control. By the middle of the 8th century, the political weather in Britain had changed from a series of local thunderstorms to a single, dominating hurricane spinning out of the Midlands. The hurricane's name was Offa. If you were a king in East Anglia during this period, you didn't look at the horizon and see a rival. You saw a landlord. Offa of Mercia was a man of terrifying competence, a ruler who didn't just want to win battles, he wanted to redesign the very concept of kingship in England. He was the first man to seriously flirt with the title Rex Anglorum, King of the English, and for the people of Norfolk and Suffolk. This wasn't a patriotic slogan. It was a notice of eviction from their own history. The relationship between Mercia and East Anglia had curdled into something suffocating. It wasn't an occupation in the modern sense, with soldiers on every street corner and checkpoints on the Roman roads. It was more subtle and insidious than that. It was a hegemony of weight. Mercia was simply too heavy to resist. The East Anglian kings, shadowy figures during this period, names like Ethelred and Aelfwald, whose lives are barely footnotes in the Chronicles, became sub-reguli, or under-kings. Imagine the humiliation of that title. You still live in the big hall. You still wear a crown. and you still have a retinue of warriors. But when Offa sends a messenger saying he's holding a council, you drop everything and ride west, not as a guest, but as a subordinate. You sign his charters, witnessing his generosity to his own followers, your signature sitting low down on the parchment beneath the Mercian bishops and the Mercian ealdormen. But the true instrument of Offa's control wasn't the sword, it was the coin. This is where the story of East Anglia shifts from the mead hall to the counting house. Offa is famous for introducing the silver penny to England, a coin that would remain the standard currency for 1,000 years. It was a masterpiece of branding, small, silver, and stamped with the king's profile. Sometimes a surprisingly realistic portrait with curly hair and a Roman nose. These pennies flowed into every market, every church, and every purse. Getty Images, and here is the kicker. A huge number of these pennies were minted in East Anglia. Why there? Because of Keepswick, Ipswich. By the late 8th century, Ipswich had exploded into the premier international port of the kingdom. While the rest of England was largely agrarian, Ipswich was a slice of the Rhineland transplanted onto the Suffolk mud. It was a grid of streets, workshops, and warehouses, smelling of Frisian timber, Rhenish wine, and the salt fish tang of the North Sea. It was the economic lung of southern England, breathing in wealth from the continent. Offa, being the astute CEO king that he was, realized that controlling the battlefield was pointless if you didn't control the cash flow. He seized the mints of East Anglia. The silver that flowed into Ipswich from trade was struck into coins bearing Offa's face, effectively turning the East Anglian economy into a battery charging the Mercian state. This economic colonization meant that East Anglia was booming, but it wasn't free. The potters of Ipswich were churning out their grey ware on an industrial scale, shipping it as far as York and Kent. The weavers were producing the high-quality wool cloth that would eventually become the region's golden fleece. But the profits were being siphoned off. Offa ran the island like a protection racket. He provided the security. His vast, terrifying armies kept the Welsh and the Northumbrians at bay. And in return, he took a cut of everything. For the merchant in Ipswich, life was probably good. Trade was stable. The currency was strong. But for the old East Anglian aristocracy, the descendants of the Woffingas who remembered the glory days of Raedwald, it must have tasted like ash. We can see the tension in the landscape itself. Offa is famous for his dyke, that monstrous earthwork on the Welsh border. But his hand was heavy in the east too. He likely reorganized the defenses and the administration of the region to suit his needs. The hundreds, the administrative divisions of land that persisted into the Victorian era, may have been formalized during this period of Mercian efficiency. It was the imposition of a grid over the organic, tribal landscape of the folk. The North folk and South folk were no longer just tribes. They were tax brackets. The East Anglian royal house, however, hadn't completely vanished. It was clinging on by its fingernails. There was a king named Ethelred, not the famous Unready one, but an earlier, more obscure version, who ruled in the shadow of Offa. He seems to have lived a life of quiet desperation, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity, while the Mercian giant loomed over his shoulder. He minted his own coins, a small act of rebellion, but they are rare compared to the flood of Offa's silver. It was a symbolic resistance. I am still here, The coins whispered, "I am still a king." But Offa's ambition knew no bounds. He was a man who corresponded with Charlemagne as an equal, or at least tried to. He wasn't content with just being a high king. He wanted to be an emperor in all but name. He began to treat the sub-kingdoms not as vassals, but as provinces. He suppressed the ancient royal lines of Kent and Sussex, effectively abolishing their kingships and absorbing them into Mercia. The East Anglians watched this with mounting horror. They knew they were next on the menu. The Wuffinger line, ancient and descended from the gods, was the only thing standing between them and total erasure. The atmosphere in the East Anglian court in the 790s must have been thick with paranoia. Every stranger was a potential Mercian spy. Every ship docking at Ipswich might be carrying orders from Offa's court at Tamworth. The church, too, was a battleground. Offa didn't like the fact that the Archbishop of Canterbury, who technically held spiritual authority over Mercia, sat in Kent, a kingdom he didn't fully trust. So he simply created his own archbishopric at Lichfield, in the heart of Mercia. He was redesigning the church to fit his state. The East Anglian bishops found themselves caught in this ecclesiastical tug-of-war, forced to bow to a Mercian primate. Yet, despite this suffocating control, a distinct East Anglian identity survived. You can't kill a culture just by changing the coins. The art of the period shows a stubborn persistence of the local style. The Tassilo chalice style of animal ornament, with its chaotic, energetic beasts, continued to flourish in the workshops of the East. The people still told the stories of Raedwald and the ship burial, even if they had to whisper them. They still venerated St. Etheldreda at Ely, a saint who had defied a king, which must have felt like a pointed political statement in itself. As Offa aged, his grip began to tighten even further. He was obsessed with the succession, determined to pass his empire intact to his son, Ecgfrith. He began to purge potential rivals, clearing the board to ensure a smooth transition. To Offa, the independent-minded king of East Anglia wasn't just a nuisance. He was a loose thread in the tapestry of Mercian Britain. If pulled, he could unravel the whole thing. The vassal state arrangement was becoming too messy for Offa's imperial taste. He wanted total integration, and so we arrive at the threshold of a tragedy. In the year 794 AD, the king of East Anglia was a young man named Ethelbert. He was popular, pious, and crucially, he was a Wuffinger, or at least closely related. He represented a resurgence of hope, a fresh face who might be able to negotiate a new deal with the aging Offa. He decided to do the bold thing, the romantic thing. He would ride into the lion's den. He would go to Offa's royal villa, ostensibly to ask for the hand of Offa's daughter, Elftrith, in marriage. It was a classic diplomatic play. Unite the houses, secure the peace, and perhaps regain some autonomy through the marriage bed. It was a fatal miscalculation. Ethelbert didn't understand that the rules of the game had changed. Offa didn't want a son-in-law. He wanted a vacancy. The young king rode west, leaving behind the safety of the fens and the familiar skies of East Anglia, crossing the border into the heart of the Mercian machine. He was riding towards a wedding, but the musicians were already tuning their instruments for a funeral. The pennies in his purse might have borne Offa's face, but the head on his shoulders was about to become the most valuable object in the kingdom, not for its crown, but for the martyrdom it would soon endure. The Mercian supremacy was about to commit its greatest sin, and in doing so, it would accidentally create its most dangerous ghost. It was supposed to be a wedding. That's the tragedy that hangs over this entire episode, like a shroud of black velvet. In 794 AD, King Ethelbert of East Anglia wasn't riding to war. He was riding to love, or at least to the kind of political alliance that passed for romance in the 8th century. He was young, he was handsome, and by all accounts, he was a man of genuine piety and charm. The kind of king who makes the chroniclers swoon a little when they write about him. He had set his sights on Alfthryth, the daughter of the terrifying King Offa of Mercia. It was a match that made perfect sense on paper. The ancient wealthy house of the Woffingas uniting with the muscular imperial power of Mercia. It should have been the start of a new era of peace. Instead, it was the preamble to a murder so foul that it would stain the reputation of the Mercian monarchy forever and turn a young suitor into one of the most beloved saints of the medieval church. Ethelbert's destination was Sutton Walls, a royal villa located near modern-day Hereford. It's an evocative place even now, an ancient Iron Age hill fort that Offa had reoccupied, turning the old ramparts into a symbol of his dominance over the Welsh borderlands. As Ethelbert rode west, leaving the flat, open skies of East Anglia for the rolling, wooded hills of the Marches, the legends say he was plagued by bad omens. The earth shook, the sun dimmed, the usual atmospheric foreshadowing that medieval writers loved to add in post-production. But in reality, the young king probably just had a knot of anxiety in his stomach. He was walking into the lair of the old lion. Offa was aging, perhaps growing paranoid, and his court was a tank of sharks. When Ethelbert arrived, the reception seemed warm enough on the surface. The prospective bride, Elfthryth, apparently took one look at the East Anglian king and was smitten. He was everything a princess in a grim fortress could want: noble, cultured, and carrying the glamour of the ancient Eastern kingdom. But while the daughter was swooning, the parents were plotting. This is where history drifts into the murky waters of folklore, particularly concerning Offa's wife, Queen Senethryth. In the later hagiographies, the saints' lives written by monks who needed a clear villain, Senethryth is painted as a Lady Macbeth figure, a Jezebel who whispered poison into her husband's ear. The story goes that she looked out of the window, saw the splendor of Ethelbert's retinue, his fine horses and his rich clothes, and turned to Offa with a sneer. "Look at him," she reportedly hissed. "He doesn't come here as a suitor. He comes as a rival. If you let him live, he will outshine you and take your kingdom." She urged Offa to kill the boy and seize East Anglia for himself. Now, modern historians are a bit skeptical of this wicked queen trope. It was very convenient for monastic writers to blame the woman while giving the great King Offa a pass, suggesting he was just a henpecked husband led astray. In reality, Offa didn't need a whisper in his ear to know that killing Ethelbert was a smart, if ruthless, political move. He had spent decades trying to absorb the sub-kingdoms. He had already extinguished the royal lines of Kent and Sussex. East Anglia was the last piece of the puzzle. Why have a son-in-law who might cause trouble when you can just have a corpse and a new province? The trap was sprung with chilling efficiency. Ethelbert was separated from his bodyguards, those loyal Thens who would have died to protect him. under the guise of a private audience with Offa. He was led through the twisting corridors of the palace, perhaps expecting a prenuptial chat with his future father-in-law. Instead, he was led into a room where a man named Grimbert, a royal executioner, or just a loyal thug, was waiting in the shadows. There was no trial, no accusation, no chance to draw a sword. Ethelbert was seized, bound, and beheaded on the spot. The brutality of the act sent a shockwave through the island. Killing a king was bad enough. Killing a guest, a man you had welcomed under the sacred laws of hospitality, was a crime against God and man. It was a violation of the most basic codes of Germanic society. To cover up the deed, the body was hastily disposed of. Some stories say it was thrown into a marsh, others that it was buried in a shallow grave near the river Lugg. The head, that terrible evidence of the crime, was kicked into a ditch. But you cannot hide a martyr. Almost immediately, the miracles began. A column of light was seen rising from the spot where the body lay, piercing the night sky like a beacon. A blind man reportedly stumbled upon the head and had his sight restored. The guilt, or perhaps the fear of divine retribution, began to gnaw at Offa. In a strange twist of irony, the body was eventually retrieved and enshrined with great honor, not in East Anglia, but right there in Mercia, at Hereford. The cathedral that stands there today, Hereford Cathedral, is dedicated to St. Ethelbert. It is a monument to Mercian guilt. The young king who came to marry a Mercian princess ended up becoming the eternal, silent judge of the Mercian people, watching over their city from his shrine. Back in East Anglia, the news of the murder must have hit like a physical blow. Their king hadn't just died. He had been butchered like cattle by the very man who claimed to be their overlord. The reaction wasn't immediate rebellion. Offa's army was too strong for that. But something deeper and more dangerous, a freezing of the soul, a profound, bitter hatred for Mercia, took root in the East Anglian soil. They saw Offa not as a high king, but as a tyrant and a murderer. Offa moved quickly to capitalize on the crime. He seized the East Anglian mints and the royal estates. There was no new puppet king installed this time. Offa simply ruled East Anglia directly. He became the king of the East Angles in name and fact. The Wulfgar line, which had stretched back to the days of the wolf gods, was seemingly extinguished. The age of the wolf was over. The age of the penny had begun. But Offa didn't enjoy his prize for long. He died just 2 years later, in 796 AD. His son, Ecgfrith, the boy for whom he had cleared the board, died only a few months after that. The great Mercian dynasty imploded. The East Anglians likely watched this with grim satisfaction, seeing it as the vengeance of Saint Ethelbert, working from beyond the grave. For the next 30 years, East Anglia remained a captive province, passed from one Mercian king to another. Coenwulf, Ceolwulf, Beornwulf. These men treated the region as a cash cow, funding their wars and their palaces with the wool and silver of the East. But the East Anglians never forgot. They kept their heads down, they paid their taxes, and they sharpened their knives in the dark. They were waiting for a moment of weakness, a crack in the Mercian armor. And they wouldn't have to wait forever. The murder of Ethelbert had fundamentally broken the bond of trust that held the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms together. It revealed that the kingdom of the English was a lie built on violence. When the external threat finally arrived, when the dragon ships from the north began to appear in greater numbers, not just to raid, but to conquer, The East Anglians would face a choice. Should they fight for their Mercian masters, the people who had murdered their beloved king? Or should they let the new invaders through, perhaps even hold the door open for them? The ghost of Ethelbert cast a long shadow. In the decades to come, when the great heathen army landed on the East Anglian coast, the memory of that severed head in the ditch at Sutton Walls would dictate the fate of nations. Mercia thought it had swallowed the wolf, but it had only swallowed a poison pill. The digestion would be slow, painful, and ultimately fatal. The year 865 AD didn't bring a storm of rain or wind to the coast of East Anglia. It brought a storm of wood and iron. For decades, the Anglo-Saxons had lived with the low-level anxiety of the summer raiders, small bands of Vikings who would splash ashore, steal a few cattle, burn a monastery, and vanish before the local militia could even put their boots on. It was like living with bad weather. You endured it, rebuilt the roof, and moved on. But what appeared on the horizon in the autumn of 865 was entirely different. It wasn't a raiding party. It was a floating city. Hundreds of longships, their square sails painted in red and white stripes, their prows carved into the shapes of dragons and serpents, clogged the sea lanes. The water churned with the sheer volume of oars. This wasn't a gang of thieves looking for silver. It was a migration of conquest. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, usually so sparse with its words, gave this force a name that still sends a shiver down the spine. The Michel Heron, the great heathen army. They landed on the East Anglian coast, likely navigating the estuaries and rivers that penetrated deep into the country. The silence of the marshes was shattered by the shouting of thousands of men in a foreign tongue. Old Norse, a harsh, guttural cousin to the Old English spoken by the locals. But this army wasn't just men. It was a mobile society. There were women, children, smiths, and merchants. They brought their own hierarchy, their own laws, and a hunger that couldn't be satisfied by a quick pillage. They weren't looking for a quick score. They were looking for a home, and they didn't care who they had to kill to get it. Leading this terrifying host were three brothers, the sons of the legendary, and possibly mythical, Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Ubba, and Halfdan. Ivar is the one who dominates the nightmares of the era. His nickname, the Boneless, has puzzled historians for centuries. Did he have a degenerative bone disease like osteogenesis imperfecta? Was he double-jointed? Or was it a metaphor for a snake-like flexibility on the battlefield? Whatever the medical reality, the historical reality was that Ivar was a genius of violence. He was a tactician who treated warfare like a game of chess played with human pieces. He didn't just want to fight. He wanted to dismantle the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms piece by piece. For the people of East Anglia and their young King Edmund, who had succeeded to the throne a decade earlier, the arrival of this horde presented an existential crisis. The East Anglian army was small, a local militia designed to chase off cattle rustlers, not to fight a continental-scale war machine. If they fought, they would be annihilated. The fields would be burned, the villages erased, and the population sold into slavery in Dublin or Constantinople. But there was another factor at play, a ghost in the room, the memory of Offa and the Mercian supremacy. Remember the deep, bitter hatred the East Anglians held for their Mercian neighbors. The memory of their murdered king, Ethelbert, was still fresh. For generations, East Anglia had been bullied, taxed, and humiliated by the kings of the Midlands. Now, staring at the Viking army, the East Anglian leadership made a cold, pragmatic calculation. Why die to protect the flank of Mercia? If this great heathen army wanted to destroy the kingdoms of England, why not let them start with someone else? Why not point them west and north, towards the enemies of East Anglia? And so, a deal was struck. It is one of the most controversial moments in East Anglian history. A pact with the devil that bought survival at a terrible price. The East Anglians approached the Viking camp not with swords, but with open hands. They offered winter quarters. They allowed the Vikings to set up a massive, fortified camp, likely near Thetford. They provided food, tons of grain, meat, and ale to feed the thousands of hungry mouths. But the Vikings wanted something else, something specific and crucial for their future campaigns. Horses. The Vikings were sailors, infantrymen who fought on foot behind a shield wall. They weren't cavalry. But Ivar the Boneless understood that in England, speed was everything. To catch the Saxon kings, to raid deep inland and return before a counterattack could be mustered, they needed to be mobile. East Anglia, with its flat, grassy plains and its long tradition of horse breeding going back to the Iceni, was the perfect place to secure mounts. The East Anglians, perhaps with heavy hearts, handed over their horses. They emptied their stables to fill the Viking remount depot. It was a massive transfer of military technology. They gave the wolves legs. The winter of 865-866 must have been a surreal time in East Anglia. You had the local Christian population living side by side with a massive pagan army. The smoke from the Viking campfires would have been visible for miles. I imagine the East Anglian farmers kept their heads down, locking their doors at night, praying that the guests would stay in their quarters. There must have been trade. Vikings had silver, looted from Francia, and they needed local goods. A strange, tense economy likely sprang up on the edges of the camp. But every time an East Anglian looked into the eyes of a Northman, they must have seen the predatory assessment. "You are useful today," those eyes said. But what about tomorrow? King Edmund, watching from his hall, perhaps at Rendlesham or Hoxton, was walking a knife edge. He was preserving his people's lives, but he was aiding the enemies of his faith. He was effectively the quartermaster for the destruction of Christian England. Did he feel guilty? Or did he feel that he had no choice? He was buying time, hoping that when spring came, the swarm would move on. And move on they did. In the spring of 866, the great heathen army broke camp. But they didn't just walk away, they rode. Mounted on East Anglian horses, a thundering column of warriors streamed north. They didn't turn west towards Mercia immediately. They headed for Northumbria, a kingdom torn apart by a civil war between two rival kings, Osbert and Aella. Ivar, with his impeccable timing, knew that a divided kingdom was an easy kill. The East Anglians must have watched the dust settle on the northern road with a profound sense of relief. The locusts had gone to eat someone else's crops. For 3 years, East Anglia breathed. They heard the terrifying news from the north and the Midlands, like distant thunder. They heard how the Vikings captured York. They heard how they ritually executed King Aella, some say with the gruesome blood eagle, though that might be later propaganda. They heard how they installed a puppet king in the north, and then turned their attention to Mercia, besieging Nottingham. The East Anglians might have even felt a dark sense of satisfaction seeing the Mercians sweat, seeing the arrogant overlords begging for help from Wessex. The strategy seemed to be working. East Anglia was the neutral supply depot, the Switzerland of the Viking Age, safe in the eye of the storm. But the thing about paying the Danegeld or appeasing a bully is that it never really ends. You just teach them that you are soft. You teach them that you have things worth taking and that you won't fight to keep them. The Vikings remembered East Anglia. They remembered the fertile fields, the rich monasteries, and the compliant population. They remembered that it was a place where they could rest and refit without a fight. In the autumn of 869, the great heathen army returned. They rode back down the Icknield Way, the ancient trackway that cuts across the chalk spine of England. But this time, the mood was different. They weren't looking for winter quarters to launch a campaign elsewhere. They were looking to finish the job. They had conquered Northumbria. They had battered Mercia. Now, they wanted East Anglia itself. They set up their base at Thetford again. But this time, the demands were steeper. They didn't just want horses and food. They wanted submission. They wanted the land. The peace of 865 had been an illusion, a temporary reprieve purchased with honor. Now, the bill had come due. King Edmund, who had spent the last few years governing a ghost kingdom, realized that he could no longer compromise. The Vikings weren't guests anymore. They were executioners. The strategic buffer of Mercia was gone. The enemy of my enemy was now just the enemy. The East Anglian policy of neutrality had failed. The wolf was back at the door, and this time he wasn't asking for a horse. He was asking for the keys to the house, and likely the head of the man who held them. The final act of the Wulfgar tragedy played out in the bleak November of 869 AD, under a sky the color of bruised iron. King Edmund had gathered what forces he could, a ragtag shield wall of housecarls, farmers, and terrified monks to meet the great heathen army near Thetford. The historical accounts are sparse, almost ashamed to record the details, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The East Anglian army was not just outnumbered, they were outclassed in every conceivable way by Ivar's veterans, men who had spent years turning war into an art form across the breadth of England. The battle was short, brutal, and decisive. The East Anglian lines crumbled like a sandcastle before the tide, and Edmund, the last of the Wolf Kings, was dragged from the carnage in chains. He was taken to a place called Hagelistun, traditionally identified as Hoxton in Suffolk, though the exact location remains a subject of fierce scholarly debate. What happened next transformed a military defeat into the foundational myth of East Anglian identity. Ivar the Boneless, the architect of the slaughter, wasn't interested in a simple execution. He wanted a theological victory. He offered Edmund a choice: become a puppet king, a vassal of the Danes, and renounce his Christian faith, or face a death so terrible it would be spoken of for 1,000 years. It was the classic confrontation between the temporal power of the sword and the spiritual power of the cross. Edmund, who had previously been a pragmatist, suddenly found a core of unbreakable steel. He refused to submit to a pagan overlord or to deny his God. The martyrdom of Saint Edmund is one of the most vivid, gruesome, and artistic scenes in the medieval imagination. According to the earliest Passio, written by Abbo of Fleury, Edmund was tied to a tree and whipped with scourges. Then, in a moment of horrific cruelty that mirrored the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, the Danish archers used the king for target practice. They shot volley after volley into his body until, as the chronicler says, he was covered with their missiles like the bristles of a hedgehog. Through it all, Edmund continued to call out the name of Christ, refusing to give Ivar the satisfaction of a scream or a plea for mercy. Finally, bored with the sport, or perhaps unnerved by his defiance, Ivar ordered his head to be struck off. The head was thrown deep into the brambles of the forest, specifically to prevent his followers from giving him a decent Christian burial, a final insult intended to deny his resurrection. But the Vikings had misunderstood the nature of the land they were trying to conquer. The forest itself seemed to conspire against them. When the Danes had moved on, Edmund's traumatized followers crept out of hiding to find their king's body. They found the torso easily enough, but the head was missing. They searched the dense, tangled undergrowth, calling out to one another, "Where are you? Where are you?" And then, from the darkness of the thicket, a voice answered, "Hic, hic, hic," Latin for "here, here, here." Following the voice, they stumbled upon a clearing and saw a sight that made them fall to their knees. A great grey wolf, the totem animal of the Wulfgar dynasty, the very symbol of Edmund's ancestors, was sitting there, guarding the severed head between its paws. It wasn't eating it. It was protecting it. The wolf allowed the men to take the head, then turned and vanished back into the shadows of the wood. This story, with its blend of Christian miracle and pagan animal totemism, struck a chord that resonated deeply with the Anglo-Saxon psyche. The people of the wolf had been saved by a wolf. Edmund's body was reassembled, and legend says the head miraculously reattached itself to the neck, leaving only a thin red thread of a scar. He was buried initially at a small chapel, but his power in death grew so rapidly, with miracles of healing reported almost daily, that his body was moved to the royal estate at Beodricksworth. This town would be renamed in his honor, becoming Bury St. Edmunds, the borough of St. Edmund. The death of Edmund did something the living Edmund could never have achieved. It unified the East Anglian people in a way that politics never could. He became the patron saint, not just of the region, but for a long time, of all England, until the imported St. George usurped him centuries later. His shrine became one of the wealthiest and most powerful pilgrimage sites in Europe. Kings like Nut and Edward the Confessor would come to bow before the body of the man who died refusing to bow. The Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds grew into a massive, sprawling complex, a city of God that dominated the landscape and the economy of the region for half a millennium. But in the immediate aftermath of 869, there was no glorious abbey, only the smoking ruins of a kingdom. With Edmund dead and no heir to take his place, the Wulfgar dynasty was extinguished. The line that traced its blood back to Woden and the Swedish warlords was gone. East Anglia was no longer an independent kingdom. It was a conquered province, the first brick in what would become the Danelaw. The great heathen army had achieved its goal. They dismantled the machinery of the Anglo-Saxon state, taking over the estates, the mints, and the courts. Yet, the Danes didn't just burn and leave, they stayed. And this is where the story of East Anglia takes a sharp, unexpected turn. The soldiers of the great heathen army, weary of the endless campaigning, looked at the rich, loamy soil of Norfolk and Suffolk and decided to trade their swords for plowshares. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that in 880 AD, the Viking leader Guthrum shared out the land among his men. This was a massive social revolution. The existing Anglo-Saxon population wasn't wiped out. They were forced to move over. A new aristocracy of jarls and holders replaced the thegns and ealdormen. Villages were renamed with Scandinavian suffixes like by settlement and thorp, outlying farm. Places like Filby, Hemsby, and Lowestoft. The landscape itself began to change under this new management. The Danes were more commercial, more urban-focused than the Saxons. They supercharged the growth of towns. Thetford and Norwich expanded rapidly, becoming bustling hubs of trade, where Viking merchants sold walrus ivory from the Arctic and silk from the Caspian. The East Anglian economy, already robust, was plugged directly into the vast Viking trade network that stretched from Dublin to Kiev. The wolf had been killed, but the dragon brought with it a ruthless, mercantile energy that made the region richer than ever. However, the shadow of St. Edmund lay heavy on the new rulers. The Danes were pagans, yes, but they were also superstitious pragmatists. They saw the power of the saints' cult rising around them. They saw the local people praying to the man Ivar had butchered. And slowly, incredibly, the conquerors began to adopt the god of the conquered. Within a generation, the Danish settlers in East Anglia were minting coins not with the hammer of Thor, but with the name of Saint Edmund. It was a psychological surrender. They had taken the land, but the land's spirit had taken them. The memorial coinage of Saint Edmund is one of the most fascinating paradoxes of numismatics. Vikings striking money, honoring the enemy king they had killed. It was their way of making peace with the ghost in the machine, of trying to legitimize their rule by co-opting the local holy man. So, the year 869 marked the end of the Waffengas, but not the end of East Anglia. It was a metamorphosis. The kingdom passed into the crucible of the Viking Age, emerging as a hybrid society, Anglo-Scandinavian, bilingual, fierce, and stubbornly independent. The wolf was dead, shot full of arrows, and thrown into the brambles. But from his blood sprang a new identity, one that would prove to be even harder for the kings of England to tame than the old one. The East Anglians were now the Danes of the East, a people with a foot in both worlds, waiting for the next roll of the historical dice. So, the wolf was dead, and the dragon had settled into its lair. But history rarely allows for a vacuum, and the chaos of the conquest eventually coalesced into a strange, stable, new reality known as the Danelaw. The architect of this new world was a man named Guthrum. If you've heard of him, it's probably as the bad guy in the story of Alfred the Great, the Viking warlord who chased Alfred into the marshes of Athelney, only to be defeated at the Battle of Edington in 878 AD. But from the perspective of East Anglia, Guthrum wasn't a loser. He was the founding father of a new state. After his defeat, he accepted baptism, taking the very English, very Christian name of Athelstan. And in return, Alfred handed him the keys to East Anglia. It was a pragmatic partition. Alfred got Wessex and the bragging rights. Guthrum got the rich, flat, fertile lands of the East. When Guthrum returned to East Anglia in 880 AD, he wasn't leading a raiding party anymore. He was leading a migration. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us he settled the land and shared it out. This wasn't a military occupation where soldiers sat in forts watching a sullen populace. This was a land grab of epic proportions. Thousands of Viking warriors hung up their swords, picked up spades, and became farmers. They didn't wipe out the existing population. Genetics and history tell us that. But they did layer themselves over the top of it, creating a hybrid society that was distinct from the rest of England. This is why East Anglia feels different even today. The Danelaw wasn't just a line on a map, it was a legal and social reality. In Wessex, society was becoming increasingly rigid, with a strong hierarchy of lords and serfs. But in the Danelaw, the Vikings imported their own social structures, which were surprisingly egalitarian. They brought with them the concept of the sokeman, a free peasant who owned his own land, paid rent, but was not bound to a lord's service in the same way a serf was. This created a fiercely independent class of farmers in Norfolk and Suffolk, men who answered to the law rather than the whip. Centuries later, when the Domesday Book was compiled, East Anglia stood out like a sore thumb because of its massive population of these free men. The roots of that stubborn East Anglian independence, the spirit that would later fuel rebellions, were planted right here in the soil of Guthrum's kingdom. The landscape itself began to speak a new language. If you look at a map of Norfolk today, you are reading a Viking registry. Any place ending in by, like Hemsby, Filby, Ormsby, was a Danish farmstead or village. A thorp, like Burnham Thorpe, was a secondary settlement. A toft, like Lowestoft, was a homestead. These names weren't imposed by royal decree. They grew organically as neighbors, one speaking Old English and the other Old Norse, shouted over the fence at each other. The languages were cousins, close enough to be mutually intelligible with a bit of effort, and they began to bleed together. We have the Vikings to thank for everyday words that cut to the chase: egg, sky, skin, window, wind-eye, and husband, the house dweller. They even gave us the grammar of they, them, and their. East English became a Creole, a rough and ready dialect born of the marketplace and the plough. Under Guthrum Athelstan, the economy of East Anglia went into overdrive. The Vikings were, at their heart, aggressive capitalists. They didn't see land just as a source of food, but as a commodity. They revitalized the towns. Thetford, sitting on the border of Norfolk and Suffolk, exploded in size. It became a sprawling industrial hub, its streets lined with pottery kilns churning out Thetford ware, sturdy, practical jars and bowls that flooded the markets. Norwich, too, began its ascent to becoming the second city of the realm. The Vikings minted silver pennies by the bucketload, copying the designs of Alfred's coins but adding their own twists. These coins circulated far beyond the borders of East Anglia, greasing the wheels of trade across the North Sea. You could buy amber from the Baltic in the market at Ipswich, using silver mined in the Middle East, brought there by a merchant who spoke Danish with a Suffolk accent. Religion in this new kingdom was a fascinating, murky soup. Guthrum was technically a Christian. He had stood in the font at Arles, with Alfred as his godfather. But how deep did that water really wash? He minted coins with his baptismal name, Athelstan, but his followers were likely slower to abandon Thor and Odin. We find evidence of this confusion in the archaeology. Pendants that look like a Christian cross if you hold them one way, and a hammer of Thor if you turn them upside down. A sensible insurance policy for a warrior who wanted to cover all his bases. But slowly, the White Christ won out. The Vikings realized that the God of the English was powerful. After all, he had access to the best administration and the written word. The Danish settlers began to patronize the monasteries they had once burned. They started burying their dead in churchyards rather than under pagan mounds. The ferocious paganism of Ivar the Boneless dissolved into a respectable, muscular Christianity that suited the martial tastes of the new aristocracy. Guthrum ruled East Anglia for 10 years, dying in 890 AD. He was buried at Hadley in Suffolk, a quiet market town, not a Valhalla. His death removed the personal bond between Wessex and East Anglia. Alfred had respected Guthrum as a godson and a fellow king, but Guthrum's successors felt no such loyalty. The East Anglian Danes began to look restlessly at the rest of England again. They were a loaded gun sitting on the flank of Alfred's kingdom. Whenever a Viking fleet from the continent raided the coast of Kent or Essex, the peaceful farmers of East Anglia would suddenly remember where they had buried their swords. They would ride out to join the raiders, turning a piratical raid into a full-blown invasion. This dual identity defined the region for generations. To the kings of Wessex, East Anglia was the Badlands, a rogue state that harbored enemies and broke treaties. But to the people living there, it was a land of opportunity. It was a place where a man could own his land, where the trade winds brought wealth from the dragon ship's routes, and where the heavy hand of the southern kings felt far away. The Danelaw wasn't a prison. It was an alternative England. It was a society building itself on a different chassis, one made of Viking individualism and Anglo-Saxon endurance. As the 9th century bled into the 10th, however, the balance of power began to tip. Alfred the Great was dead, but his son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter, Ethelflide, the Lady of the Mercians, were not content to simply contain the Danelaw. They wanted to reconquer it. They began a methodical, terrifyingly efficient campaign of fortress building, inching their way forward, strangling the Danish territories one by one. The East Anglian Danes looked west and saw the wall of burhs, fortified towns, creeping closer. They knew that sooner or later, the English were coming to take their England back. The era of the independent Viking kingdom was drawing to a close, but the fight to integrate this stubborn, Scandinavianized province would take more than just a few battles. It would require the breaking of a people who had forgotten how to kneel. Alfred the Great is the one who gets the statues and the burnt cakes anecdotes. But if you want to talk about the man who actually forged England with a hammer and anvil, you have to talk about his son, Edward the Elder. When Alfred died in 899 AD, the kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons was still a fragile idea, a half-built house battered by winds from every direction. Edward inherited the blueprints, but he brought a different kind of energy to the construction site. He wasn't the scholar his father was. We don't have translations of Latin pastoral care manuals written by Edward. He was a soldier, a logistics expert, and a man possessed of a terrifying, relentless patience. He looked at the map of Britain, saw the great blot of the Danelaw covering the east and north, and decided that he wasn't going to negotiate with it anymore. He was going to erase it. For the Danes of East Anglia, the accession of Edward marked a dangerous shift in the temperature. They had grown comfortable with the stalemate. They raided a bit. The Saxons raided back. Treaties were signed. Hostages were exchanged, and life went on. But Edward didn't play by the old rules of raid and retreat. He played a game of advance and cement. He and his formidable sister, Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, began a coordinated pincer movement that is still studied in military colleges today. They built burhs, fortified towns, not just to defend their own lands, but to aggressively encroach on Danish territory. They would march into hostile ground, build a fortress, garrison it with professional troops, and then dare the Vikings to knock it down. It was a strategy of slow strangulation, turning the open frontier into a cage. But before Edward could tighten the noose, he had to deal with a family squabble that threatened to burn the whole kingdom down. His cousin, Ethelwald, felt that he, not Edward, should have been king. When the Witan, the royal council, disagreed, Ethelwald did what any disgruntled Saxon prince would do. He went to the Vikings. He rode to East Anglia, presenting himself as the rightful king of Wessex. The East Anglian Danes, always happy to throw a wrench in the gears of the southern monarchy, didn't just welcome him, they acclaimed him as their king. This was a nightmare scenario for Edward, a Saxon pretender leading a Viking army. The climax of this dynastic drama came in 902 AD at the Battle of the Home. The location is murky, likely somewhere in the Cambridgeshire fens or perhaps near home in Norfolk. It was a bizarre, chaotic engagement. Edward, realizing he was overextended, ordered a retreat. But the men of Kent, stubborn and bloodthirsty, disobeyed the order. They stayed behind to fight the pursuing Danes. In the ensuing slaughter, the Kentish contingent was mauled. But they took the cream of the Viking leadership with them. The pretender Ethelwald was killed, and critically, so was Eorik, the Danish king of East Anglia. It was a tactical defeat for the English that turned into a massive strategic victory. The East Anglian Danes were left leaderless, their royal line decapitated in the mud. With the pretender dead and the East Anglian throne empty, Edward began his long grind. For the next decade, the pressure was unrelenting. Every summer, the English armies would push a little further east, burning the crops of the Danish settlers, seizing their cattle, and reminding them that the cost of independence was starvation. It was a brutal campaign of attrition. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle for these years is a repetitive litany of violence. In this year, Edward went to and built the burh at. The noose tightened. Witham in Essex was fortified in 912, locking down the southern approaches. Buckingham in 914. Bedford in 915. The English were building a wall of spears and stone, moving inexorably towards the heart of East Anglia. The year 917 AD was the breaking point. It was the year Edward decided to finish the game. He launched a massive, multi-pronged offensive that overwhelmed the Danish defenses. The English army moved on Dorchester and then surged towards the great Danish strongholds. The Vikings in East Anglia, exhausted by years of constant warfare and demoralized by the relentless advance of the burhs, tried to mount a defense. They broke out of Huntingdon and Colchester, trying to smash the English forts. But they were repulsed with heavy losses. The momentum had shifted permanently. The Army of East Anglia, that proud, independent force that had terrorized England for 50 years, was a spent shell. The end didn't come with a bang, but with a collective sigh of resignation. The Danish army, based at Colchester, seeing the writing on the wall, and the English army at the gates, sued for peace. But this wasn't a treaty between equals like Alfred and Guthrum had signed. This was a surrender. The Chronicle records that the army which belonged to East Anglia swore union with him, that they would all that he would, and would keep peace with all with whom the king kept peace, both on sea and on land. It was a total submission. Edward the Elder had done what no king before him had managed. He had brought the East back into the fold, but Edward was smart enough to know that you can't rule a proud people with a boot on their neck forever. The reconquest wasn't an ethnic cleansing. There were no mass deportations of Danish settlers. The farmers who said egg and sky stayed on their farms. The merchants in Ipswich kept trading. What changed was the management. Edward allowed the local laws and customs of the Danelaw to remain largely intact. He understood that as long as the taxes flowed south and the soldiers answered his call, it didn't matter if they counted land in karukates, a Danish measurement, instead of hides, a Saxon one. This pragmatism created a unique political landscape in East Anglia. It became a super earldom, a semi-autonomous province within the Kingdom of England. The local aristocracy remained a mix of surviving Danish jarls and loyal Saxon thegns planted by Edward. The legal system retained a distinct Scandinavian flavor for centuries. The 12 thegns of the Danelaw jury system are often cited as a precursor to the modern English jury. The region was English again, but it was an Englishness spoken with a heavy Norse accent. The reintegration of East Anglia also meant the return of the church's full authority. The bishoprics, which had been in a state of chaos or abeyance during the Viking years, were reorganized. But the church that emerged was different too. The Viking settlers, now enthusiastically Christian, brought their own aesthetic to the faith. We see this in the hogback tombstones and the stone crosses carved with knotwork that blends Christian symbolism with Viking dragon motifs. The Lion of Judah and the Serpent of Midgard were wrestling on the same stone blocks. The reconquest also supercharged the economic integration of the region. Ipswich, now fully back under royal control, became a vital cog in the English economic machine. The pottery industry in Thetford and Norwich didn't slow down. It ramped up. The stability provided by Edward's King's Peace meant that a merchant could travel from York to London without being robbed, or at least with a significantly lower chance of being robbed. The Pax Edwardiana was good for business. However, the psychological scar of the reconquest remained. The East Anglians had been conquered twice in 50 years, first by the Danes, then by the West Saxons. They had learned a hard lesson. Loyalty to a distant king is a fluid concept. They had welcomed Ethelwald the Pretender because he promised them autonomy. They submitted to Edward because he promised them survival. They were becoming a people who looked out for themselves first. The distinct identity of the East folk was hardening into a stubborn regionalism that would frustrate kings for centuries to come. They were inside the tent of the Kingdom of England now, but they were standing right near the exit, arms folded, watching. Edward the Elder died in 924 AD, leaving behind a kingdom that stretched from the Channel to the Humber. He had stitched the severed limb of East Anglia back onto the body politic. The scars were visible. The bones had knitted together a bit crookedly, but the patient was alive. The dragon ships had stopped coming. The burrs had turned into bustling market towns, and the wolf of the Woffingas slept quietly under the floorboards of the new English state. But the story wasn't over. A new century was approaching, bringing with it new dangers, new treacheries, and a tall, terrifying man named Thorkel, who would remind the English that the Vikings hadn't gone away. They had just been waiting for the right moment to pick up their axes again. Section 15. By the turn of the millennium, the Pax Edwardiana that had stitched East Anglia back into England was fraying at the seams. The 10th century had been a time of recovery, of monastic reform, and of burr building. But as the year 1000 approached, the sky over the North Sea began to darken once again. This wasn't the superstitious dread of the apocalypse, though plenty of monks were preaching that the end was nigh. This was the very real, very sharp dread of steel. The Second Viking Age had begun. Unlike the earlier migrations of farmers looking for land, these new fleets were led by professional warlords, men like Svein Forkbeard and Thorkel the Tall, who viewed England not as a home, but as a bank vault to be cracked open. And East Anglia, with its fat sheep, wealthy monasteries, and accessible rivers, was the front door to the vault. The region was now governed not by kings, but by ealdormen, high-ranking officials appointed by the English crown to manage the province. But in late Saxon England, an ealdorman was effectively a king in all but name, especially in a place as independent-minded as East Anglia. The man tasked with defending this dangerous frontier during the crisis years of King Ethelred the Unready was a figure who deserves to be as famous as Alfred or Arthur: Ulfsketil Snillinger. His nickname, Snillinger, translates roughly to the bold or the wise, implying a man who was quick-thinking and brave. He needed to be both because he was about to face the full wrath of the Danish crown. The storm broke in earnest in 1004 AD. Svein Forkbeard, the king of Denmark, sailed his fleet up the River Yar and sacked Norwich. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gives us the grim itinerary. Svein came with his fleet to Norwich and plundered and burned the borough. Imagine the smoke rising from the wooden houses, the screaming in the streets, the blackened timbers of the churches. Norwich, which had grown rich on Anglo-Scandinavian trade, was turned into a charred skeleton in a single afternoon. Svein then moved inland, aiming for Thetford, the industrial heart of the region. Ulfsketil, realizing he couldn't match Svein's numbers in a pitched battle, tried a desperate gambit. He negotiated. He bought time with a truce, hoping to gather his forces while the Danes counted their silver. But Svein, sensing weakness, broke the truce and marched on Thetford, putting it to the torch. This betrayal seems to have snapped something in Ulfsketil. He gathered every man he could find: the local militia, the housecarls, the farmers with pitchforks, and ambushed the Danish army as they returned to their ships. The battle that followed was ferocious. The Chronicle admits that there was the hardest handplay among the East Anglian people. Ulfsketil's men, fighting for their burning homes, hammered the Danish shield wall with a fury that stunned the invaders. They came agonizingly close to wiping out the Danish leadership. If the order to destroy the Danish ships had been carried out by Ulfsketil's reserves, Svein might have been trapped and killed there in the Suffolk mud. As it was, the Danes barely escaped, limping back to their longships, muttering that they never met worse handplay in England than Ulfsketil brought them. It was a defeat, technically, but a moral victory that proved the East Anglians were not the soft targets they appeared to be. But bravery alone cannot stop a tidal wave. The raids continued, bleeding the country dry. Ethelred's government, paralyzed by infighting and poor leadership, resorted to paying the Danegeld, massive bribes of silver to make the Vikings go away. East Anglia, as one of the wealthiest regions, bore the brunt of this taxation. The pennies minted in Norwich and Thetford flowed out of the country by the ton, ending up in hoards across Scandinavia. We are still finding them today in Swedish fields. The lost GDP of East Anglia paid to protect it from fire. Then, in 1009, a new player entered the game, a man who seemed to have stepped straight out of a saga. Thorkel the Tall was a Jomsviking, a member of a legendary brotherhood of mercenaries known for their suicidal bravery and rigid code of honor. He arrived with a massive fleet, not to conquer, but to extort. For 3 years, Thorkel's immense raiding army ravaged the country. East Anglia was trampled again, in 1010, at the Battle of Ringmere near Thetford. The East Anglian army made another stand. Ulf Teitel was there again, leading the line. But this time, treachery from within the ranks doomed them. A Thane named Thurseytel, Mare's Head, a name that surely implies an insult, fled the field just as the battle began, triggering a panic. The Danes slaughtered the East Anglians, effectively breaking the region's military power for a generation. Ulfzitel himself fell a few years later at the Battle of Assandun, the final tragic defeat that handed England to the Danes. With the conquest complete in 1016, the Danish prince Knut became King of England. Knut was a shrewd operator. He knew that to rule this fractious island, he needed to divide and conquer. He split the country into 4 great earldoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia. And who did he give East Anglia to? The man who had terrorized it, Thorkel the Tall. It was a classic poacher-turned-gamekeeper scenario. Thorkel, the giant who had burned the towns, was now the Jarl, the Earl, responsible for rebuilding them. And surprisingly, he did a good job. Under Thorkel, East Anglia enjoyed a period of stability and recovery. He ruled like a viceroy, holding court in the restored halls, drinking deep, and ensuring that the taxes were collected on time. The region became the power base for the Danish occupation. It was uniquely suited for it. The heavy Scandinavian settlement from the previous century meant that Thorkel wasn't an alien occupier here. He was just the biggest wolf in a pack that was already half wolf. The earldom of East Anglia in the early 11th century was a formidable political entity. It was wealthy, heavily militarized, and culturally distinct. The earls who followed Thorkel, men like Harold Godwinson, yes, that Harold, used the region as a stepping stone to the throne. Harold, before he was king, was Earl of East Anglia. He cut his teeth here, managing the wealthy ports of Ipswich and Norwich, dealing with the stubborn freemen of the fens, and building the network of loyalty that would eventually lead him to Hastings. This period also saw a massive boom in church building. Cnut, like Guthrum before him, was anxious to prove his Christian credentials. He poured money into the restoration of the monasteries his father and Thorkel had burned. The Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds was refounded as a Benedictine monastery. Given vast estates and privileges, the Liberty of St. Edmund was created, a huge swath of West Suffolk where the abbot held absolute power, answerable only to the king. It was a state within a state, a holy fiefdom that essentially turned the western half of the earldom into a theocracy. But beneath the surface of this prosperous, recovered earldom, the old fault lines remained. The East Anglian nobility was a viper's nest of intrigue. The native English families were constantly jockeying for position against the Danish newcomers. Betrayal was the currency of the court. We see this in the story of the murder of the Etheling Alfred in 1036. Alfred, the brother of Edward the Confessor, came to England to claim the throne after Cnut's death. He was intercepted by Earl Godwin, Harold's father, betrayed, and handed over to the brutal new Danish king, Harold Harefoot. Alfred was blinded and died of his wounds at Ely, right here in the heart of the Fens. The monastery that had once been a sanctuary for saints became a prison for princes. It was a grim reminder that in the 11th century, East Anglia was a dangerous place to be a tourist, especially if you had royal blood. As the late Saxon period drew to a close, East Anglia was richer than it had ever been. The wool trade was exploding. The population was booming. Norwich was now one of the largest cities in Northern Europe, a dense, noisy warren of 5,000 people, huge for the time. There were dozens of churches in the city alone. The landscape was filling up. The Domesday Book, compiled a few decades later, would show that East Anglia was the most densely populated and wealthiest part of England. It was the engine room of the kingdom, but engines are prizes to be captured. As the year 1066 approached, the political storm clouds were gathering again. The death of Edward the Confessor set off a chain reaction that would bring a new kind of invader to the shores. The East Anglians, who had weathered the Romans, the Angles, the Mercians, and the Vikings, were about to face a threat that wouldn't just conquer them, but would fundamentally rewrite their DNA. The Normans were coming, and unlike Thorkel, they didn't want to be earls. They wanted to be owners. The late Saxon twilight was a golden hour, bathing the fens and the fields in a warm, rich light. But the sun was setting fast. The long ships had been replaced by cavalry transports, and the round shields were about to meet the kite shields. The earldom was ready, fat and happy, totally unprepared for the iron fist that was about to smash the table. The year 1066 is usually remembered for the arrow in the eye at Hastings, but for East Anglia, the real trauma didn't arrive on the battlefield. It arrived in the paperwork. When William the Conqueror seized the English throne, he didn't just want to be king. He wanted to be the landlord of the entire country. The old Anglo-Danish aristocracy, the men who had run the show from the halls of Thetford and Norwich, were systematically stripped of their estates. Their lands were handed over to William's cronies, men with sharp Norman names like Bigod, Warren, and Mallet, who spoke French, built stone castles, and looked at the local peasantry not as free men, but as assets on a spreadsheet. It was a hostile takeover of corporate proportions. The Free East was being enclosed, taxed, and subjugated. But the Normans made one critical mistake. They forgot about the fens. They looked at that vast, waterlogged wilderness to the west of the region. The 1,000 square miles of black bog, reed beds, and treacherous peat, and saw nothing but a wasteland. They didn't realize that for the locals, the fens were a fortress, and hiding inside that fortress was a man who was about to give William the biggest headache of his life. His name was Hereward. History calls him the Wake, meaning the watchful or the wary. But to the Normans, he was simply a terrorist. Hereward is a tricky figure to pin down because he is wrapped in so much legend that he feels like a prototype for Robin Hood. But he was very real. He wasn't a dispossessed prince or a saintly martyr. He was a tenant of the Abbey of Peterborough, a rowdy, violent, charismatic mercenary who had been exiled before the conquest for causing too much trouble. When he returned to England around 1070 AD, expecting to reclaim his family lands in Lincolnshire and Norfolk, he found a Norman sitting in his house, drinking his ale and collecting his rents. Hereward didn't file a lawsuit. He killed the Norman, cut off his head, and placed it over the door as an eviction notice. The resistance began. Hereward retreated to the Isle of Ely, that same holy island where St. Etheldreda had built her monastery 4 centuries earlier. By 1070, Ely had become the Alamo of Anglo-Saxon England. It was a natural citadel, rising 50 feet above the sea level of the surrounding marshes, accessible only by a few secret causeways known only to the locals. Hereward turned the abbey into a rebel base. He was joined by a motley crew of the dispossessed. Earl Morcar, the former Earl of Northumbria, bishops fleeing their dioceses, and hundreds of landless thanes who preferred to die fighting in the mud than live as servants to the French. The most famous incident of the rebellion, and the one that perfectly encapsulates Hereward's chaotic energy, is the sack of Peterborough. In 1070, William appointed a Norman abbot named Turold to run the wealthy Abbey of Peterborough. Turold was a militant monk, a man who wore armor under his habit and arrived with a heavily armed escort. Hereward, hearing that a Norman was coming to grab the church's treasure, decided to save it. He and his band rowed their boats right up to the abbey walls. The monks tried to lock them out, but Hereward burned down the gate, and most of the town rushed into the church and stripped it bare. They took the gold crosses, the jeweled books, the silver candlesticks, everything that wasn't nailed down. Hereward claimed he was protecting the hoard from the Normans, holding it in trust for the true English church. Of course, the treasure was never seen again, likely used to pay his Danish mercenaries, but the logic was delightfully twisted. I robbed the church to save the church. William the Conqueror was not a man accustomed to being mocked by a swamp bandit. He came north in 1071 to deal with the Ely problem personally. He blockaded the island, stationing his fleet off the coast to cut off supplies and ringing the fens with his army. But getting at Hereward was the problem. The Normans were heavy cavalry. They were built for charging on dry grass, not wading through peat bogs. Every time they tried to advance, they sank. Hereward and his fen tigers knew the terrain intimately. They would slip through the reeds in their flat-bottomed punts, ambush the Norman patrols, and vanish into the mist before the knights could even turn their horses around. It was guerrilla warfare in a landscape that actively hated the invaders. William, growing desperate, decided to build a massive causeway, a bridge of wood, stones, and cowhides, to march his army straight onto the island. He conscripted thousands of local peasants to haul the timber. The bridge snaked out across the water, heavy with armored knights, but Hereward had weakened the supports, or perhaps just waited for the weight to do the work. As the Norman army surged forward, the structure groaned and collapsed. Hundreds of knights, weighed down by their chainmail, plunged into the black water and drowned in the sucking mud. The Gesta Herewardii, the medieval account of his deeds, claims that only one knight survived to tell the tale. It was a humiliation for the greatest general in Europe. So, William tried psychological warfare. He erected a tall wooden tower on the edge of the fen and paid a local witch to climb up and curse the defenders. The idea was to terrify the superstitious Saxons. The witch stood there, screaming enchantments and baring her backside at the rebels, a traditional medieval insult. Hereward's response was practical. He didn't counter with his own wizard. He just sneaked through the reeds and set fire to the dry grass around the tower. The wind whipped the flames up, consuming the tower, the witch, and the surrounding Norman camp in a firestorm. The Normans watched in horror as their supernatural weapon went up in smoke. But every siege has its breaking point, and usually it's not the walls that fail, but the will. The monks of Ely, who had initially welcomed Hereward, were getting tired. They were men of peace, not war. They were watching their larder empty and their cloisters fill with rough soldiers. They just wanted to go back to chanting and eating. William, realizing he couldn't beat Hereward with force, made a deal with the monks. If they showed him the secret path onto the island, the one solid track through the marshes, he would spare the abbey and restore their lands. The betrayal was swift. The monks guided the Norman army through the mists. Hereward was caught completely off guard. The Normans surged onto the high ground of the island, slaughtering the defenders. Earl Morcar surrendered and was thrown into prison for the rest of his life. The rebels were hunted down, their eyes gouged out or their hands cut off as a warning to others. The last resistance was crushed, but not Hereward. In true action hero fashion, he escaped. Legend says he slipped away through the reeds, perhaps disguised as a potter or a fisherman, disappearing into the wild Fenland he knew so well. He was never caught. Some chronicles say he eventually made peace with William and was allowed to keep his lands, serving as a soldier in the Norman army in France. A classic case of, if you can't beat him, hire him. Others say he died fighting a group of Norman knights who ambushed him while he was eating his dinner, fighting them off with a spit and a shield until his spear broke. Whatever his end, Hereward the Wake left a ghost in the machine of Norman East Anglia. He proved that the conquest wasn't seamless. He gave the English a story to tell around the fire, a story where the local boy outsmarted the French king. But his defeat marked the final closing of the door. The Isle of Ely, once the sanctuary of freedom, was turned into a Norman stronghold. William built a castle right inside the abbey precincts to keep an eye on the treacherous monks. The liberty of St. Etheldreda was now under new management. The fall of Ely in 1071 meant that the Norman takeover of East Anglia was total. The new lords began to reshape the landscape in stone. They looked at the wooden halls of the Anglo-Saxon thegns and sneered. They wanted castles, massive stone declarations of power that said, "We are here, and we are not leaving." The flat skyline of Norfolk and Suffolk was about to be punctured by the square keeps of the conquerors. The rebellion was over. The occupation had begun. And the first thing the Normans did was to ensure that the wealth of the region, the wool, the grain, the silver, flowed directly into their own coffers. Hereward had fought for the past, but the future belonged to the men who built high walls and wrote everything down in Latin. With the rebellion of Hereward crushed and the last of the Saxon resistance rotting in prison or hiding in the reeds, the Normans turned their attention to what they did best: construction. The conquest of East Anglia wasn't truly finished at the Battle of Hastings, nor at the Siege of Ely. It was finished with the trowel and the chisel. The Normans brought with them a psychological need to dominate the landscape, to write their ownership in letters of stone so large that even the illiterate peasantry could read them. Before 1066, the skyline of East Anglia was low and organic. Thatched roofs, timber halls, wooden church towers that weathered grey like the winter sky. After 1070, that skyline was punctured by the terrifying bright white geometry of the Norman keep. The epicenter of this architectural shock and awe was Norwich. William the Conqueror identified the city as the key to the region. It was rich, populous, and dangerously prone to Danish sympathies. To tame it, he didn't just build a garrison. He reshaped the geology of the city itself. The Normans demolished nearly 100 Saxon homes, an entire neighborhood erased without compensation, to clear the space for their new headquarters. Then, they dug a circular ditch of immense proportions and piled the earth into a monstrous artificial hill, the Castle Mound. It was a feat of engineering that required an army of forced laborers, likely the very Saxons whose homes had just been flattened. On top of this mound rose Norwich Castle. It wasn't the grim, windowless bunker we often associate with medieval dungeons. It was a palace. The keep was faced with high-quality limestone shipped all the way from Caen in Normandy. Think about the logistics and the arrogance of that. They ignored the local flint and timber, preferring to import the very bedrock of their homeland to encase their power. When it was new, that stone would have shone a blinding white in the sun, a beacon of alien authority, visible for miles. The exterior was covered in blind arcading, purely decorative arches that served no military purpose other than to say, "We are so rich and so secure that we can afford to make our fortress look like a jewelry box." It was a palace keep, designed to host kings and intimidate earls. Inside, it was a world of French speech, wine, and administrative efficiency, floating above the sullen, English-speaking town below. But the castle was just one half of the pincer. The Normans understood that to truly control a people, you had to control their souls as well as their bodies. In 1094, the bishopric of East Anglia was moved from the sleepy town of Thetford to the booming metropolis of Norwich. The new bishop, Herbert de Lusignan, was a man who embodied the Norman church. Ambitious, worldly, and a builder of titanic vision. He had technically bought his position, a sin known as simony, and to atone for it, he embarked on building a cathedral that would rival the greatest basilicas of Europe. Norwich Cathedral rose from the marshy ground near the river like a stone leviathan. Like the castle, it required the destruction of a Saxon settlement to clear the site. Its scale was simply incomprehensible to the local population. The nave was incredibly long, the ceiling soared to dizzying heights, and the walls were thick enough to withstand a siege. It was built in the Romanesque style. Heavy, rounded arches, sturdy pillars, a sense of muscular Christianity that brooked no argument. At the east end, de Lusignan built a curved apse, a distinctly French design feature that had never been seen in East Anglia before. The stone, again, was cairn limestone, barged up the River Wensum. The message was identical to that of the castle. God speaks French now. This Stone Age of the 12th century wasn't limited to the capital. The Norman lords, the Bigods, the Warrens, the Albanese, fan out across the countryside, planting their flags in the soil. At Castleacre in Norfolk, the Warren family created a perfect model of a Norman colony. They built a massive earthwork castle to control the Beders Way, and right next to it, they founded a Cluniac priory. The ruins of Castleacre Priory are still some of the most evocative in England. Acres of intricate arcading and silent cloisters. It was a planned settlement, a town built to service the castle and the monastery. The chaos of the Saxon village was replaced by the grid of the Norman town. Order, hierarchy, revenue. This brings us to the Norman yoke. It's a phrase that historians argue about, but for the average East Anglian peasant, it was a very real, very heavy weight. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, gives us a snapshot of this theft. It is effectively a list of loot. In entry after entry, we see the names of the old English thanes, Edric, Wulfric, Godric, crossed out or vanished, replaced by names like Roger Bigod or William de Warenne. The freemen of East Anglia, those independent farmers of the Danelaw tradition, found their status eroding. They were slowly being pushed down into serfdom, bound to the land, forced to grind their corn at the Lord's mill for a fee, and bake their bread in the Lord's oven for a fee. The soak, the right of jurisdiction, was privatized. Justice was no longer a matter for the folkmoot. It was a revenue stream for the lord of the manor. The Bigod family, in particular, became the robber barons of the region. Based at their castles in Bungay and Framlingham, they treated East Anglia as their personal fiefdom, often defying the king himself. Hugh Bigod, a man who changed sides in the civil wars of the 12th century more often than he changed his tunic, is a perfect example of this new breed of magnate. He built a massive stone keep at Bungay, and famously boasted, in legend at least, "Were I in my castle of Bungay, upon the river of Waveney, I would ne'er care for the king of Cockney." It captures the spirit of the age. Feudal lords, who felt stronger than the state, hunkered down behind walls of flint and mortar, protected by private armies of knights. Yet, we must give the devil his due. The Normans were brilliant economists. They hated waste. They looked at the sprawling, inefficient Saxon estates and rationalized them. They drained more fenland. They planted more vines. Yes, vineyards were common in Norman East Anglia, thanks to a slightly warmer climate. And they supercharged the wool trade. The sheep became the most important animal in the kingdom, more valuable than the warhorse. The Normans connected East Anglia directly to the textile markets of Flanders and northern France. The wool, grown on the backs of Suffolk sheep, was sheared, baled, and shipped across the narrow sea to be woven into the finest cloth in Europe. The wealth generated by this trade was staggering. And it was this wool money that paid for the soaring stone towers that began to appear in every village. The parish churches of East Anglia are the enduring legacy of this economic boom, while the cathedral and the castles were the projects of the 1%. The thousands of stone churches that dot the Norfolk and Suffolk landscape were often community efforts, funded by the growing prosperity of the wool trade. But even here, the Norman influence was stark. They replaced the wooden Saxon chapels with flint and stone structures. They introduced the round tower, a quirk of East Anglian architecture born from the lack of good building stone for corners, groins. Without limestone to make sharp corners, the local masons built round towers using the abundant local flint. There are more round tower churches in East Anglia than anywhere else in England, a vernacular response to a Norman demand. By the end of the 12th century, the trauma of the conquest had begun to scar over. The sharp distinction between Norman and Saxon was blurring. The bigots and Warrens were marrying into the remnants of the English aristocracy. The languages were merging, the French of the court and the Anglo-Norse of the fields colliding to form Middle English. But the landscape had changed forever. The open, fluid world of the Wuffingas and the Vikings was gone. In its place was a compartmentalized, fortified world. You couldn't walk more than a few miles without seeing a stone tower, a symbol that you were being watched, counted, and taxed. The Normans had brought iron discipline to East Anglia. They had locked the region into the feudal grid of Europe, but they hadn't broken its spirit. The ghost of Hereward still haunted the fens, and the memory of St. Edmund still protected the liberty in the west. The stone walls were high, but the people inside them were still the same stubborn, litigious, independent-minded folk who had defied Rome and Vikings alike. They were just waiting for the next opportunity to remind their masters that stone can be pulled down just as easily as it can be put up. And as the Middle Ages wore on, and the wool boom turned East Anglia into the richest workshop in the world, that opportunity would come in the form of peasant revolts and Lollard heresies. The Iron Age of the Normans was settling in, but the fire of the East was merely banked, not extinguished. If you were to fly over East Anglia in the 14th or 15th century, looking down with the eye of a god or a particularly high-flying buzzard, the first thing you would notice wasn't the castles or the cathedrals, but the dots. Millions of white dots moving slowly across the green checkerboard of the landscape. These were the sheep, the sturdy, hardy breeds of Old Norfolk, Horn, and Suffolk. And they were the living engines of the greatest economic boom England had ever seen. We often talk about the gold rushes of California or the Yukon, but East Anglia had a wool rush that lasted for 300 years. The alchemy of the region was simple. Grass went into the sheep, and gold came out. This era, the High Middle Ages, was when East Anglia truly became the workshop of the world. For centuries, the English had been content to shear their sheep and sell the raw sacks of wool to the Italians and the Flemish, who would then weave it into fine cloth and sell it back to the English at a premium. It was a classic raw material economy. But in the 13th and 14th centuries, the East Anglians realized they were being ripped off. Why sell the ingredients when you can cook the meal? They began to weave. The catalyst for this industrial revolution was a specific type of cloth that took its name from a humble Norfolk village, worsted. Worsted cloth was different. It was made from long staple wool, combed rather than carded, creating a yarn that was strong, smooth, and relatively lightweight. It wasn't the heavy, itchy felt of the past. It was a high-tech fabric for the medieval consumer. The demand was insatiable. From the peasants in the fields to the merchants in the Hanseatic League, everyone wanted worsted. The village of Worsted itself became a boom town, its church growing to cathedral-like proportions on the profits of the loom. But the true capital of this new wool empire was likely Lavenham in Suffolk. Walking through Lavenham today is like stepping onto a movie set where the director shouted, "Cut," in 1490, and everyone just walked off. It is a preserved medieval cityscape. The timber-framed houses lean drunkenly over the narrow streets, their beams warped by time, their plaster painted in that iconic Suffolk pink. historically made by mixing pig's blood with whitewash, though we use gentler ingredients today. The crowning jewel is the Guildhall of Corpus Christi, a timber palace built by the rich merchants to regulate the trade and show off their terrifying wealth. In the reign of Henry VIII, Lavenham was the 14th wealthiest town in all of England, richer than York or Lincoln. It paid more in taxes than most large cities. The wealth generated by the Golden Fleece didn't just go into private pockets, it went into the skyline. This is the age of the wool churches. If you drive through the quiet lanes of Suffolk and Norfolk today, you will encounter village churches that seem impossibly, ludicrously large for the tiny hamlets they serve. Take the Church of the Holy Trinity in Long Melford. It is 250 feet long. It has over 100 vast stained glass windows. It looks like a cathedral that got lost and decided to settle down in a village. This wasn't built by the Vatican. It was built by the Clopton and Martin families, local wool tycoons, who were effectively competing to see who could build the biggest stairway to heaven. The sheer amount of flint, limestone, and glass used in these buildings is a staggering testament to the disposable income of the East Anglian gentry. Norwich, sitting at the center of this spiderweb of commerce, grew fat and powerful. By the 1300s, it was indisputably the second city of the kingdom, a dense, noisy, smelly metropolis enclosed by a massive circuit of flint walls. It was a city of bells. They said there was a church for every week of the year, 52, and a pub for every day, 365. The River Wensum was choked with barges carrying wool bales down to Great Yarmouth and bringing back wine, spices, and stone. But Norwich also had a secret weapon: immigration. Edward III, realizing the English needed better technical skills, invited Flemish weavers to settle in the region. These strangers, as they were called, brought with them advanced loom technology and new dyeing techniques. They were the silicon chips of the textile industry. They settled in Norwich and the surrounding towns, bringing their canaries, the ancestors of the Norwich City FC mascot, and their distinct culture, supercharging the local economy. But this golden age had a dark, necrotic underbelly. East Anglia was densely populated, and its connection to international trade routes meant it was the highway for germs as well as goods. In 1349, the Black Death arrived. It tore through the packed streets of Norwich and the crowded cottages of the wool towns with apocalyptic fury. Some estimates suggest that over half the population of East Anglia died in a few terrifying months. The worsted looms fell silent. The sheep wandered unsheared in the fields because there was no one left to tend them. Villages were abandoned entirely, leaving only the grass-covered humps of house platforms, the shrunken medieval villages that archaeologists map today. Yet, the economy was remarkably resilient. The survivors found themselves in a new world. Labor was suddenly scarce. The freemen and the serfs realized they were valuable. They demanded higher wages. The lords, desperate to get the harvest in and the wool sheared, had to pay up. For a brief, shining moment, the balance of power tipped toward the peasantry. But the government, terrified by this social mobility, passed the Statute of Laborers, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It was an attempt to legislate against the laws of supply and demand, and it made the people of East Anglia furious. The explosion came in 1381. We call it the Peasants' Revolt, and we usually focus on Wat Tyler in London. But the rebellion in East Anglia was arguably more dangerous. more organized, and more radical. It was led by a dyer from Felmingham named Geoffrey Litster. Litster didn't just want lower taxes, he wanted a revolution. He declared himself the King of the Commons. He rode through Norfolk with a massive army of rebels, seizing the gentry, capturing Norwich, and effectively ruling the county for a week. He even forced the captured nobles to serve him dinner on bended knee, a delicious piece of social theatre designed to humiliate the ruling class. The response of the establishment was brutal, and it came in the form of a man who sounds like a villain from a fantasy novel. Henry le Despencer, the Bishop of Norwich. Despencer was a fighting bishop, a man who preferred the mace to the crosier. He didn't wait for the king's army. He gathered his own retinue of knights and smashed the rebels at the Battle of North Walsham. The King of the Commons was captured, drawn, and quartered. The revolt was crushed. The pieces of Litster's body displayed across the county as a grim warning. But you can't kill an idea with a sword. The spirit of 1381 lingered. East Anglia became a hotbed of lollardy, a proto-Protestant movement that questioned the wealth and corruption of the church. The deep, dark naves of the wool churches echoed with the whispers of heresy. The weavers, sitting at their looms for 12 hours a day, had time to think, and they thought dangerous thoughts about equality and the Bible. This intellectual restlessness, born of trade and literacy, meant that when the Reformation finally arrived in the 16th century, East Anglia would be its most fertile ground. By the end of the medieval period, East Anglia was a paradox. It was incredibly beautiful, a landscape of soaring towers and pink-washed timber houses. It was incredibly rich, the cloth of its looms clothing the kings of Europe. But it was also a powder keg of social tension. The wealth was too concentrated, the bishops were too powerful, and the middling sort, the merchants and the yeoman farmers, were getting restless. They were tired of the feudal past. They were ready for something new. The Golden Fleece had bought them a ticket to the modern world, and they were impatient for the journey to begin. The Middle Ages were ending, not with a whimper, but with the clinking of coins and the sharpening of minds. By the time the 17th century dawned, East Anglia had transformed into the spiritual boiler room of England. The seeds of heresy sown by the Lollards in the weaving towns had germinated into a fierce, uncompromising Puritanism. This wasn't the gentle, stained-glass Christianity of the past. This was a religion of the book, stripping away the popish rituals, the incense, and the idols to reveal the hard, unforgiving wood of the cross beneath. The close trade links with the Netherlands meant that radical Calvinist ideas flowed into ports like Yarmouth and Ipswich, along with the bales of cloth. The weavers and the yeoman farmers sat in their whitewashed meeting houses, reading their Geneva Bibles and nodding in agreement that the King, Charles III, with his Catholic wife and his high church bishops, was leading the country straight to hell. When the Civil War finally cracked the country open in 1642, East Anglia didn't hesitate. It became the bedrock of the parliamentarian cause, while the rest of England fractured into a messy patchwork of royalist and roundhead territories. East Anglia formed the Eastern Association, a solid block of counties: Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Cambridgeshire, Hertfordshire, that became an impregnable fortress for Parliament. It was the engine of the war effort, providing the money, the supplies, and crucially, the men. It was from the fen-edged towns of this region that a minor landowner named Oliver Cromwell recruited his Ironsides, sober, God-fearing men who charged into battle singing psalms and broke the king's cavalry with a discipline that terrified the cavaliers. But while the armies were marching away to fight at Marston Moor and Naseby, a different kind of war was being waged at home. The Civil War shattered the legal and social structures of the countryside. The assize courts, the regular visits of the king's judges, stopped functioning. The traditional authority of the local gentry was disrupted. In this vacuum of law and order, fed by the apocalyptic preaching of the Puritan ministers who saw the war as a cosmic battle between Christ and Antichrist, a dark paranoia began to bloom in the Essex and Suffolk clay. The terror arrived in the form of a man named William Dowsing. In 1643, he was appointed Commissioner for the Destruction of Monuments of Idolatry and Superstition for the region. Dowsing was a bureaucrat of vandalism. He traveled from village to village, methodically smashing the faces of stone angels, tearing down the superstitious brasses from tombs, and shattering the glorious medieval stained glass that the wool merchants had paid for. The clink-clink of Dowsing's hammer echoing in the empty naves of Suffolk churches was the sound of a culture erasing its own past. He kept a diary, recording his destruction with the meticulous pride of a tax auditor. At Clare, we break down 1,000 pictures superstitious. But smashing stone was only the rehearsal. The real enemy wasn't in the windows, it was in the cottages. In 1645, a shadow fell across the town of Manningtree in Essex. His name was Matthew Hopkins. He called himself the Witch-Finder General, a title he invented and bestowed upon himself with a terrifying grandeur. Hopkins was a failed lawyer, a man of middling status and obscure background, who suddenly found his calling in the hunting of the internal enemy. Along with his associate, John Stern, he unleashed a reign of terror that remains the worst chapter in British legal history. The psychology of the witch craze is complex, but in East Anglia, it was fueled by the specific anxieties of the time. The men were away at war. The crops were failing. The plague was bubbling up again. The world felt like it was ending. When a cow died, or a child fell sick, or the beer went sour, it wasn't just bad luck. It was malice. It was the devil working through his agents. And who were the agents? Usually the poor, the elderly, the marginalized women who muttered to themselves, who kept cats for company, who relied on the charity of their neighbors. In a society stressed to the breaking point, charity turned to resentment, and resentment turned to accusation. Hopkins and Stern turned this village gossip into a professional industry. They charged the towns for their services, a fee for the discovery, a fee for the execution. They developed a system of interrogation that was designed to break the mind without technically breaking the law. Torture was illegal in England. They used watching. The suspect would be stripped, searched for witch marks. Any mole, wart, or skin tag would do, and then forced to sit on a stool in the center of a room. They were kept awake for days and nights on end, walked back and forth until their feet blistered, constantly questioned by the watchers. Sleep deprivation is a powerful hallucinogen. After 3 days without sleep, these terrified, confused old women would confess to anything. Sleeping with the devil, suckling imps, sinking ships. They would name their familiars, giving them absurd domestic names like Vinegar Tom, Sack and Sugar, or Jamara. The swimming test is the image we all know. The suspect bound thumb to toe and thrown into the village pond. If they floated, the water, a pure element used in baptism, was rejecting them, proving their guilt. If they sank, they were innocent, and hopefully hauled out before they drowned. That Hopkins championed this, though he relied more heavily on the sleep deprivation tactics. The result was a conveyor belt of death. In the summer of 1645 alone, more people were executed for witchcraft in East Anglia than in the entire previous century across the whole of England. The trial at Bury St. Edmunds in August 1645 was the grim climax. 18 people were hanged in a single day. The hysteria spread like a contagion through Suffolk, Norfolk, and Cambridgeshire. In the coastal town of Great Yarmouth, the witch-finders sent 5 women to the gallows. At King's Lynn, the paranoia was so thick you could taste it. Hopkins was treated like a celebrity, a savior who was cleansing the land of spiritual pollution. He rode from town to town, likely wearing a broad-brimmed hat and a cloak, the very image of the Puritan avenger. But the most chilling aspect of the East Anglian witch hunt is not the malice of Hopkins, but the complicity of the neighbors. Hopkins didn't drag these women out of their houses. The villagers did. He simply provided the mechanism for them to act on their grudges. It was a community purging itself of its difficult members. It was the widow who cursed you when you refused her bread. It was the midwife who presided over a stillbirth. The witch trials were a way to settle old scores under the guise of holy war. Eventually, the fever broke. As the Civil War wound down and the traditional courts began to function again, questions started to be asked. A brave country parson named John Gall preached against Hopkins, calling his trade idolatrous. Judges began to demand actual evidence rather than the delirious ramblings of sleep-deprived grandmothers. The cost of the trials, paying Hopkins, the jailers, the executioners, was also bankrupting the local councils. By 1647, Hopkins had retired to Manningtree, where he died of tuberculosis, consumption, later that year. The legend that he was swum and drowned by his own victims is poetic justice invented by later folklore. But the reality was more mundane. He coughed his lungs out in his bed, believing to the end that he had done God's work. The scars of the 1640s went deep. The Witchfinder General had devastated the social fabric of East Anglia. He had taught neighbors to fear one another. He had decimated the female population of entire villages. But ironically, the Civil War period also strengthened the region's identity. The Eastern Association had proven that East Anglia was the powerhouse of the nation. It was East Anglian money and East Anglian soldiers who had defeated the king. The region emerged from the war with a sense of grim republican pride. They were the godly, the elect, the people who had stood firm against tyranny, even if, in their zeal, they had also turned on their own grandmothers. As the 17th century moved into the Restoration, the Puritan fire began to cool, or at least go underground. The meeting houses remained, evolving into the nonconformist chapels that would define the region's character for centuries. The Quakers, the Baptists, the Congregationalists, they all found fertile soil in the East Anglian clay. The Witchfinder became a boogeyman story to frighten children, but the independent, questioning spirit that had allowed such radicalism to flourish remained. East Anglia was done with kings and bishops telling it what to do. It was looking outward again, towards the sea. And on the horizon, a new challenge was rising, not from the devil, but from the water itself. The fens, those ancient, untamed wetlands that had sheltered Hereward and St. Guthlac, were about to face their final conqueror. The Dutch were coming, and they were bringing their windmills. For thousands of years, the fens were a world that refused to be mapped. To the outsider, looking down from the dry chalk uplands, it was a terrifying flat emptiness, a labyrinth of black water, reedy meres, and sudden, treacherous fogs that could swallow a traveler whole. It was a place where the earth was liquid and the sky was immense. But to the people who lived there, the fen tigers, it was a paradise. They lived a life that was amphibious. They walked on stilts to cross the marshy ground. They punted flat-bottomed boats through secret waterways known only to their families. They feasted on the millions of eels that writhed in the mud and the clouds of wildfowl that darkened the autumn skies. They were free, ungovernable, and deeply suspicious of anyone who arrived on a horse. To them, the water wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a wall that kept the taxman and the landlord away. But the 17th century was the age of reason, and to the rational, capitalist mind, the fens were an abomination. They were messy. They were unproductive. They bred mosquitoes and malaria, and worst of all, they didn't generate rent. The great landowners of the day, led by the aristocratic Russell family, the Earls of Bedford, looked at this soggy wilderness and saw gold. If they could just pull the plug, if they could drain the water away, they would reveal hundreds of thousands of acres of the richest, blackest soil in Europe. It was the ultimate terraforming project. But English engineers didn't have the know-how to fight the sea, so they looked across the North Sea to the people who had been wrestling the ocean for centuries, the Dutch. Enter Sir Cornelius Vermuyden. He was a Dutch engineer with a vision as straight and sharp as a ruler. He didn't care about the romance of the reeds or the ancient rites of the fowlers. He saw the fens as a geometry problem. His plan was audacious. He would ignore the winding, lazy courses of the ancient rivers, the Ouse, the Nene, the Cam, and dig massive, straight artificial rivers to hustle the water out to sea as fast as gravity would allow. These were the cuts. The old Bedford River and the new Bedford River, dug by armies of labourers, including Scottish prisoners of war, sliced through the landscape like scars. They were feats of brutal efficiency, defying the natural contour of the land to impose a mathematical order on the chaos. The fen tigers did not go quietly. This was an ecological war. The drainage destroyed their livelihood. When the water level dropped, the fish died, the ducks flew away, and the osier beds dried up. The common land, where they had grazed their cattle in summer, was enclosed and handed over to investors, the gentlemen adventurers, who had funded the drainage. The locals fought back with a campaign of sabotage that would have made Hereward the Wake proud. They smashed the sluice gates, broke the dikes in the dead of night to reflood the land, and assaulted the Dutch workmen. It was a guerrilla war between the men of the reed and the men of the spade. But technology, backed by money, is a juggernaut. Vermuyden brought in wind power. The skyline of the fens began to sprout windmills, not the picturesque grain mills of the postcards, but wind pumps, driving great scoop wheels that lifted the water from the low-lying fields up into the high-banked rivers. The Dutch influence seeped into the very architecture of the region. If you walk through towns like King's Lynn or Wisbech today, you will see the Dutch gables on the merchant houses, the red brick, the wide, tree-lined canals. It is a landscape that feels less like England and more like a lost province of the Netherlands. The tragedy and the triumph of the drainage is that it worked too well. As the water was pumped away, the peat, which is effectively a giant sponge composed of rotted vegetation, began to shrink. It dried out and compressed. The land surface actually sank. This created a bizarre, never-ending cycle. The more they pumped, the lower the land got, and the higher the rivers sat above the fields. The windmills had to be made bigger, then replaced by steam engines, and finally by massive electric pumps that hum quietly in brick sheds today, keeping the North Sea at bay. At Home Fen, there is a cast iron post that was driven into the ground in 1851, its top level with the soil. Today, the ground level is 4 meters below the top of the post. That is how much of the landscape has simply vanished into thin air, oxidized away by the wind. The draining of the fens changed East Anglia from a defensive fortress into the breadbasket of Britain. The black soil, once the bottom of a swamp, proved to be incredibly fertile. It fueled the agricultural revolution. Wheat, potatoes, and sugar beets grew here in abundance, feeding the industrial cities of the north. The wild, misty world of St. Guthlac and Hereward was replaced by a factory floor of agriculture, vast horizon-spanning fields with nary a hedge to break the wind, where tractors crawl like beetles under a massive domed sky. The mystery was traded for calorie efficiency. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the history of the Eastern Angles. We have traveled a long way together, haven't we? From the ghost ships of Sutton Hoo, where Raedwald slept in his garner-studded splendor, to the fiery rebellion of Boudicca screaming against the Roman machine. We have seen the wolf kings of the Woofingas rise from the sandlings, and the saints of Ely build their cathedrals on islands of clay. We watched the Vikings burn Thetford, and then settle down to sell pottery, turning the Danelaw into a bustling hybrid state. We saw the Normans build their white towers to crush the spirit of the freeborn, and the wool merchants build their glass cages to catch the light of God. We saw the witchfinder stalk the lanes in his black cloak, and finally, the Dutch engineers draw their straight lines across the map, turning the water into wheat. East Anglia today is a palimpsest of all these layers. It is a place that still feels slightly apart from the rest of England. It is a cul-de-sac, a destination rather than a thoroughfare. Because it is bypassed by the great motorways that rush north to Scotland, it has kept its secrets better than most. The dialect still holds the ghost of the Viking tongue. The flint churches still glow in the sunset. And out on the coast, the sea is still eating the land, reclaiming dunnage one gravestone at a time. It is a land of big skies and deep roots, a place where the past isn't just a story in a book, but a physical presence. In the burial mounds on the heath, in the Roman bricks reused in a Saxon church tower, and in the black earth of the fens that remembers the water. As you drift off tonight, imagine that landscape. Picture the long, slow rivers gliding towards the sea. Picture the mist rising over the marshes, hiding the wolf and the king. The history is quiet now. The battles are over. The noise of the looms has faded. There is only the wind in the reeds and the peace of the heavy, sleeping earth. Good night.